They didn't even look up when she walked in. That was the thing Eliza Vance remembered most, not the laughter that came later, not the sharp edges of the words they threw at her like broken glass. It was the moment before all of it, when she stood in the doorway of the Red Hollow Grange Hall, with mud on her boots and rain in her hair, and every single person at that long table just kept talking, kept laughing, kept eating as though she were a piece of furniture someone had left in the wrong room. Then Harriet Boone looked up. Harriet Boone, who owned 3,000 acres and wore silk on a Tuesday, looked at Eliza the way you look at something you've accidentally stepped in. Slow, deliberate. And then she leaned to the woman beside her and said loud enough for the whole table to hear, "Why is the ranch hand sitting with us?" The room didn't go quiet. It got louder because people laughed. And Eliza Vance, who had buried her mother alone, who had walked 40 miles to get to this town, who had not eaten a full meal in 3 days, stood there and felt every single one of those laughs land on her skin like a brand. If you've ever been made to feel like you don't belong in a room, you worked just as hard to get to stay with this story. Because what happened next in Red Hollow changed everything. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss what's coming. Like this video and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that night. Because it was the night everything in Red Hollow began to crack. The Grange Hall had been built 30 years ago by men who believed the land owed them something. It smelled like pine sap and old ambition, that particular combination of wood polish and boot leather that clings to places where powerful people gather to remind themselves they're powerful. Long tables ran the length of the room, draped in white cloth that had gone slightly yellow at the edges, and lanterns hung from iron hooks bolted into the rafters. Every year, on the last Friday of September, the ranching families of Red Hollow filled those tables for what they called the Harvest Gathering, which was really just a formalized occasion for the town's established families to eat well, make deals, and quietly decide who mattered and who didn't. Eliza Vance had not been invited. She'd come because May Sutton, who ran the small kitchen at the Dalton Ranch where Eliza now worked, had sprained her ankle that morning and couldn't carry the 2 covered pots of venison stew that the Daltons were obligated to contribute to the communal table. Thomas Dalton himself had handed Eliza the pots and waved her off with the particular indifference of a man who had already forgotten she existed before she'd left the yard. So she came in, she carried the pots, she set them on the serving table near the door, the way May had described. And then she stood for a moment, just a moment, not sure whether she was supposed to leave immediately or wait to take the pots back. And that was the moment Harriet Boone chose to look up and open her mouth. "Why is the ranch hand sitting with us?" Eliza hadn't been sitting. She'd been standing 12 feet from the table. But that distinction didn't matter. Harriet Boone had decided what the sentence would be before she'd finished looking, and once Harriet Boone said a thing in Red Hollow, it became the shape of reality for everyone in the room. The laughter was immediate and layered, some of it genuine, some of it reflexive, some of it the nervous kind that comes from people who are relieved the cruelty is aimed somewhere else. A man named Burke Aldous, who sat at Harriet's left and owned the largest feed store in the county, shook his head with that particular smile of his that never reached his eyes. "Didn't realize the Daltons were sending their help to dine with us," he said. "Should we set an extra place? Maybe she can muck the stalls between courses." More laughter. Eliza's jaw went tight. She had practiced at this, the particular discipline of keeping your face neutral while your insides went to war. She'd learned it young, in a town 3 counties east of here, where her mother had worked as a seamstress for women who spoke to her like she was a slow child while wearing the dresses her mother's hands had made. Eliza had watched her mother absorb it, again and again, with a patience that had looked like grace and turned out to be something more like slow erosion. She wasn't her mother, but she also wasn't stupid. She knew the math of the room. 12 families around that table, each of them holding some piece of land or money or reputation that the other families needed. She was nobody here. She was less than nobody. She was a reminder that some people existed to serve and not to sit. And in a room like this, that reminder made the people around the table feel better about themselves. She picked up the empty pot carriers and turned toward the door. "She's leaving," someone said, as if that were funny. "Smart girl," said another voice. And this one Eliza recognized it belonged to Clara Finch, who was 42 years old and had never worked a day in her life and spent most of her energy ensuring that no other woman in Red Hollow felt comfortable in her presence. Clara Finch, who wore her hair in elaborate arrangements and spoke in a voice like honeyed vinegar. "At least she knows her place." That one landed different. Eliza stopped walking. She didn't know why she stopped. She'd been halfway to the door and her legs just paused. Some stubborn knot of something in her chest that refused on some animal level to let that sentence be the last word of the evening. She turned around, not because she had a plan, not because she had the right words ready, but because some part of her was just done. Done with the math, done with the calculation, done standing in doorways waiting to be acknowledged. She looked at Clara Finch directly. "My place," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt, "is wherever I've earned the right to stand." The room went genuinely quiet now, the kind of quiet that has weight. Harriet Boone's expression shifted from amusement to something colder. Burke Aldous set down his fork. Clara Finch's smile didn't disappear, it just changed shape, became something harder, more deliberate. "Earned," Harriet repeated, as though the word were foreign. "And what exactly have you earned, girl? You've been in this town, 3 months? Working on Thomas Dalton's broken-down plot of dirt? That's not earning. That's surviving, and barely. It was a perfect strike. Precise, economical, designed to hit exactly where it would hurt most, because Harriet Boone had not built her position in Red Hollow by being imprecise." Eliza felt the heat rise in her face. She was aware, suddenly and acutely, of the mud on her boots, of the mended hem on her dress, of the fact that she'd eaten half a biscuit for lunch, and her hands were still slightly roughened from the morning's fence work. Every physical detail of herself that she'd learned to stop noticing came rushing back in one searing wave. And she almost said nothing. She almost turned back around and walked out the door and let Harriet Boone have the room. Because the alternative, standing her ground in front of people who had already decided she wasn't worth considering, felt like throwing yourself against a stone wall and expecting the wall to move. That was the moment Colt Mercer stood up. She hadn't noticed him before. He'd been sitting at the far end of the table, near the window, which was apparently where he preferred to be. She would learn later that Colt Mercer had a deep and abiding distrust of the center of any room. He was not the tallest man there, not the broadest, not the one wearing the finest jacket. He had dark hair that needed cutting, and a jaw that looked like it had made some acquaintance with hard weather and harder years. He was the kind of man who, if you passed him on the street, you'd notice something in his eyes before anything else, a particular quality of attention, like he was actually looking at whatever he looked at instead of just letting his eyes pass over it. He stood up slowly, the way he did most things, and he picked up his plate, and he walked the length of the table. He pulled out the chair directly beside Eliza. He sat down in it. He set his plate on the serving table, which was not meant for sitting at, and he looked at Harriet Boone with the expression of a man who has decided something and is now entirely at peace with that decision. "I'll eat here," he said. Nobody spoke. Harriet Boone stared at him. "Colt, that venison stew smells better from this end of the room anyway," he said. And then he picked up his fork and resumed eating, as though the entire situation were perfectly ordinary. The silence that followed was the most complicated Eliza had ever stood inside. She could feel the room recalculating the weight and meaning of what had just happened. Colt Mercer was not a man anyone in Red Hollow dismissed. He ran the Mercer spread to the north of town, 400 acres that he'd built alone after his father died, and left him nothing but debt and a half-collapsed barn. He'd done it through what people called stubbornness, and what was actually just a refusal to accept the version of reality other people offered him. He owed nothing to the families around that table, and they knew it, which meant his standing there was not a social courtesies they could explain away. He had chosen a side. In Red Hollow, that was not a small thing. Eliza stood for a moment, aware that everyone was watching her now with a different quality of attention, and then she did the thing that surprised even herself. She sat down. Not because she was comfortable, not because she felt welcome. She sat down because Colt Mercer had made a decision that would cost him something, and walking away from it would waste what he'd spent. She didn't look at him directly. She picked up a spoon and served herself from one of the pots she'd carried in, and she kept her eyes on the middle distance, and she breathed. Harriet Boone said nothing more that evening. Burke Aldous resumed eating. Clara Finch's expression stayed somewhere between outrage and calculation for the rest of the night, her gaze moving between Eliza and Colt in a way that felt like arithmetic. No one spoke to Eliza for the remainder of the gathering. But no one laughed at her again either. Afterward, when the tables were being cleared and the families were pulling on their coats in the cool September air, Colt Mercer found Eliza loading the empty pots onto the back of the Dalton wagon. He didn't say much. He had the manner of a man who'd decided speech was a resource to be conserved. "You do that often?" he asked. "Carry pots?" She didn't look up. "Say something when you shouldn't." She lifted the second pot and set it in the wagon bed and turned to look at him for the first time head-on. He had an honest face. That was her first clear impression, not handsome, necessarily, though he was that too in an unfinished kind of way, but honest. The kind of face that doesn't bother with the particular performance most people maintain in public. Only when someone's wrong, she said. He considered that. Harriet Boone doesn't take correction well, I noticed. She'll make things harder for you. She already doesn't like the fact that you're working the Dalton place. Why does she care what I do at the Dalton place? He looked at her steadily. Because she wanted that land. And Thomas Dalton didn't sell it to her. She's been waiting for an excuse to see him fail for 2 years. He paused. You working there gives her a story to tell that the ranch is so far gone it's hiring whoever wanders through. It hit her like a physical thing, the realization that her presence there wasn't just personal for Harriet Boone. It was strategic. She was a piece in a game she hadn't known was being played, and she'd just made herself more visible in it by opening her mouth in a room full of people who already wanted the Dalton Ranch to fail. Wonderful, she said flatly. Something shifted in Colt's expression that might generously have been called the beginning of a smile. You're not from here, are you? No. What are you running from? She turned back to the wagon. I'm not running from anything. Everyone comes to Red Hollow from somewhere else, he said. And they're all running from something. He said it without judgment, which was what made it land. You don't have to tell me what it is. She was quiet for a moment. The night air was cold and smelled like pine and coming rain. Down the road, the lights of the Grange Hall were going out one by one. I came here because it was far enough, she finally said. Which was true and also told him almost nothing. She'd gotten good at answers like that. He nodded as though that was a sufficient explanation. The Dalton place needs water work, he said. Shifting register without warning, the way practical men do. The North Pasture well is silting up. You know anything about that? She looked at him sideways. I know enough. Thomas Dalton doesn't know what he's got in that land, Colt said. It didn't sound like flattery, it sounded like an assessment. The old creek bed on the east side of his property cuts under the ridge. If someone looked at it properly, really looked, there might be a secondary source he doesn't know about. She'd seen the creek bed. She'd walked that ridge twice in her first week because she'd had the instinct that the water table there was deeper and more complex than anyone was giving it credit for. She hadn't said anything about it because nobody had asked, and she hadn't yet earned the kind of trust in this place that allowed a woman to offer opinions about hydrology without being looked at like she'd suggested something indecent. Why are you telling me this? She asked. He picked up his hat from the wagon wheel where he'd set it. Because you're the one working that land every day, he said. And because Harriet Boone is planning something with the Water Commission. Don't know what yet, but when she starts planning, it's usually bad for everyone who isn't Harriet. He put his hat on. Watch the creek bed, he said. And then he walked away into the dark, and Eliza stood beside the wagon and listened to the sound of his boots on the gravel road growing quieter, and felt the particular disorientation of having arrived at a situation she hadn't anticipated. She'd come to Red Hollow to disappear. She'd carried 2 pots of stew and kept her head down and planned to stay invisible until she'd saved enough money to move on. That had been the plan. Standing in the September dark, with Harriet Boone's words still burning somewhere behind her sternum, and Colt Mercer's receding footsteps in her ears, Eliza understood that the plan was already broken. She drove the wagon back to the Dalton Ranch, through roads that were starting to go soft with the first drops of rain. The horse knew the way. She sat on the bench and let her hands rest on her knees and stared at the dark shapes of the hills against the darker sky and tried to think clearly. She thought about the creek bed. She thought about the Water Commission, whatever that was. She thought about the way Harriet Boone had said earned like the word itself was an absurdity in Eliza's mouth. She thought about her mother, who had never once talked back to anyone who dismissed her, and who had died quietly in a rented room 3 counties east, with nothing to show for 30 years of careful invisibility. Eliza had not left that town on good terms. She'd left it in the middle of the night with $40 and a worn suitcase and a secret that she could not, under any circumstances, allow to follow her here. She'd walked away from something she could admit that much to herself, alone on a wagon bench in the rain, but she had also walked toward something. She just hadn't known what yet. The Dalton Ranch came into view at the end of the road. It was a humble thing in the dark, the main house. Small and practical, the barn listing slightly to one side the way old barns do. The fence line she'd been repairing for 6 weeks, running in a slow circuit around the property. Thomas Dalton was probably asleep. May Sutton was probably icing her ankle. The horses would need to be checked. She unhitched the wagon, led the horse to his stall, checked water and feed, and then stood in the barn for a moment in the particular quiet that only barns at night produce the sound of animals breathing, the shift of straw, the creak of wood settling. She'd been good with horses since she was 10 years old. Better with them than with most people, if she was honest. Horses didn't care about mud on your boots. They didn't calculate your social utility before deciding whether to acknowledge you. They were direct in their needs and clear in their responses, and they never laughed at you for being in a room they thought you didn't belong in. She rested her hand on the gelding's neck for a moment and felt the warmth of him and the solidity of him and thought, I have been here before. Different place, same room, and I survived it each time. The rain was coming down properly now, drumming on the barn roof in the familiar rhythm of a night that intended to be wet through till morning. She'd need to check the north fence line at first light. The softer ground would show any damage, any place where the wire had pulled loose from its posts. The creek bed on the east property line would run higher after this rain, which meant she'd be able to get a clearer look at the way the water moved through that ridge. She thought about what Colt Mercer had said. She's planning something with the Water Commission. She didn't know enough yet. She didn't know enough about the town, about Harriet Boone, about what the Water Commission had authority over, and how that authority could be used against someone. She'd been here 3 months, and she'd kept her head down by design, and now that design felt like a liability. She would need to learn things. She would need to be more careful and at the same time, more present, which was a contradiction she didn't yet know how to resolve. She left the barn and walked through the rain back to the small room off the back of the main house where she slept. Stripped off her muddy boots at the door, lit the small lamp and sat on the edge of the narrow bed and unbuttoned her cuffs. On the windowsill above the wash basin sat the worn suitcase she'd arrived with. She didn't open it often. There were things inside it she needed to keep away from the daily business of her life here, papers mostly. A photograph, a letter she'd read so many times the folds had gone soft as cloth. Pieces of who she'd been before, which she couldn't afford to be anymore, and couldn't quite manage to leave behind. She sat with her hands on her knees for a long time, listening to the rain. She thought about the faces around that table. Burke Aldous with his small, careful eyes. Clara Finch with her measuring smile. Harriet Boone, who had looked at her like she was something to be removed. She thought about Colt Mercer, sitting down at an empty table with a plate of stew, and the quiet, immovable certainty of a man who had simply decided. She thought, I don't know this man. I don't know why he did that. People who do things like that usually want something. And then more quietly, or maybe they just couldn't stand to watch. She lay down without changing clothes and pulled the thin blanket over herself and stared at the ceiling while the rain moved across the roof. She did not sleep quickly. Sleep was never quick for her. Too many years of listening for sounds that shouldn't be there. Too many nights in rooms where safety was a provisional thing. But eventually the rain steadied to a consistent murmur, and the lamp burned down, and the horses were quiet, and Eliza Vance closed her eyes in the small room at the back of a struggling ranch on the edge of a town that had already decided she didn't matter. She didn't know yet what she was going to do. She only knew that something had shifted in the architecture of her situation, and that the creek bed on the east ridge was worth looking at more carefully, and that a man had sat down beside her tonight when no one else would, and that those 3 facts would somehow connect into something she couldn't see the shape of yet. She slept. Outside, the rain kept falling, and the land absorbed it, and somewhere beneath the ridge, in the old creek bed that no one had looked at properly in 30 years, water moved in the dark the way it always had, patient, purposeful, indifferent to what the people above it thought about where it did and didn't belong. The creek bed was exactly what she'd thought it was. She found it on a Tuesday, 3 days after the gathering, in the gray early morning while the rest of the ranch was still quiet. The rain from that night had moved through and left the ground soft and honest, the kind of ground that shows you what it's doing if you take the time to look. Eliza had taken the time. She'd walked the east ridge from the property corner all the way to where the old creek bed curved north, and she'd crouched down at intervals and pressed her palm flat against the earth and paid attention. The water was there. Not on the surface was dry, cracked in the older patches, unremarkable. But 8, maybe 10 feet down, she could feel the logic of it. The way the ground sloped, the way certain grasses grew thicker in a line that followed no visible water source. The particular way the soil changed color in a band running northeast, which meant something was feeding it from below. She didn't tell Thomas Dalton right away. Not because she was hiding it more, because Thomas Dalton was the kind of man who responded to incomplete information with panic. And she didn't have complete information yet. He was 53 years old, slope-shouldered and perpetually worried, the kind of man who had inherited a competent ranch and then watched it slowly become something less through a combination of bad luck, worse judgment, and a stubborn unwillingness to ask for help until the situation was already critical. His wife had died 4 years ago. His son had gone east for work and hadn't come back. He ran the ranch now with May Sutton's kitchen help, and Eliza's labor and a part-time hand named Denny who showed up 3 days a week and smelled like he'd been somewhere better the other 4. Thomas trusted Eliza with the horses and the fencing and the daily work. He did not yet trust her with something like this, the suggestion that his land was worth more than either of them currently understood. That would require a different kind of conversation, and she wasn't ready to have it. She spent the next week gathering information instead. She rode into town on Thursday mornings, which was when the dry goods store got its weekly delivery, and half the county came through to collect orders and talk. She was quiet, which people mistook for slowness. She listened while she waited. She learned that the Red Hollow Water Commission had met twice in the past month, which was unusual. They normally met quarterly. She learned that Harriet Boone had filed some kind of petition, the details of which nobody at the dry goods store seemed to know precisely, though they all had theories. She learned that the 2 smallest ranches in the valley, the Kelsey Place and Old Frank Drum's operation to the south, were already struggling with their well levels after the dry summer, and that both families were privately frightened in the way people get when they can see the edge, but can't quite admit it to themselves yet. And she learned, through the particular efficiency of small-town information networks, that Colt Mercer had been seen at the county records office in Sutter Creek the week before, pulling land surveys. She thought about that for a long time. On a Friday afternoon, he rode onto the Dalton property unannounced. She was in the north pasture working a young mare who'd been favoring her left foreleg, not lame, but compensating for something, moving with the careful asymmetry of an animal that had learned to protect itself from a pain that might not even be there anymore. Eliza was working her in slow circles, watching the movement, paying attention to where the hesitation lived. She heard his horse before she saw him. She didn't stop what she was doing. He pulled up at the fence and watched for a moment. She could feel him watching in the way you feel weather, coming a change in the quality of the air, a shift in your own awareness. She kept her attention on the mare. "Left stifle," he said finally. She glanced at him. "You can see that from there?" "I can see the way she's carrying herself." He rested his forearms on the top rail. "She's not protecting the leg. She's protecting the memory of hurting it." That was accurate, and she resented it slightly. Not because he was wrong, but because she'd been about to say exactly the same thing, and now it felt like ceding something. "What do you want, Mr. Mercer?" "I pulled the land surveys for this property last week," he said, "and the 3 adjacent parcels, including the Boone holdings." She brought the mare to a halt and turned to look at him directly. "I heard, did you?" He didn't seem surprised. "What did you hear?" "That you were at the county office." "Not why." He was quiet for a moment, the way he got quiet not uncertain, more like he was choosing which version of a truth to lead with. "The Water Commission petition Harriet Boone filed," he said. "I finally found out what it is. She's applying for a diversion rights claim on the Upper Creek tributary, the one that runs along the east edge of this property." Eliza went still. "If it's granted," he continued, "she'll have legal authority to redirect the surface flow. Can't touch the groundwater, that's a different class of right, but she can cut off the surface access. Which means the Dalton Place loses its primary irrigation source for the east pastures. And without that, the ranch fails within 2 seasons, Eliza said. Within 1, the way Thomas has been running it. She let that settle. The mare shifted beneath her hands, impatient with the stillness, and Eliza made herself breathe steadily, because the animal would feel whatever she was feeling, and she didn't want to communicate the particular cold fury that was currently moving through her chest. "She's been planning this," Eliza said. It wasn't a question. "She's been planning this since Thomas refused to sell her the east 40 acres 2 years ago. The drought just gave her the conditions she needed. Colt's voice was even informational. He wasn't performing outrage, he was delivering facts, which she found, strangely, more alarming. The commission grants her claim before the fall session closes. It takes effect at the start of next water year. That's 7 months. Thomas doesn't know about this petition. No one told him. Harriet made sure the filing was done through a proxy, a land management company out of Sacramento that handles the paperwork, so the name Boone doesn't appear until the final approval document." He paused, by which point it's too late to contest it. Eliza looked at him. "How did you find this out?" Something moved across his face that she couldn't entirely read. "I have a cousin who works at the commission office in the county seat," he said. She mentioned it without knowing what she was mentioning. "I had to pull the surveys to confirm what I suspected." He held her gaze. "There's another piece." She waited. "The underground water on this property, the secondary source on the east ridge that I mentioned at the gathering, it's documented in the original land survey from 1871. Whoever filed those surveys knew it was there. But the documentation was recorded under a survey amendment that wasn't attached to the main property record. It's in a separate ledger." He shifted his weight on the fence rail, which means Thomas doesn't know it's on his land. And Harriet does, because her grandfather was the original county surveyor. The shape of it came clear all at once, the way things do when you've been looking at pieces individually, and then step back and see the whole. Harriet Boone wasn't just trying to redirect the creek. She was engineering the conditions under which Thomas Dalton would fail, after which the land she'd known for decades contained a significant underground water source would be available at a distressed price. It was not crude, it was patient and structural and almost elegant in its nastiness. She's been waiting for this for years, Eliza said. Probably her whole adult life, Colt said. Her grandfather knew what that land was worth. She was raised knowing. Eliza dismounted slowly and stood beside the mare with one hand on the animal's neck. Her mind was working fast, and she needed to let it work without interference, which meant she needed to not look at him for a moment, because looking at Colt Mercer required a portion of her attention that she currently couldn't spare. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Same question she'd asked him in the dark outside the Grange Hall. "Because you already know the land," he said, "and because you're the one who's going to be working it when it fails, if it fails, and I'd rather it didn't." "That's not a complete answer." A pause. "No," he said. "It's not." She looked up at him. He was watching her with that quality of attention she'd noticed the first night, the kind that doesn't categorize, just takes things in. "I sat at that table 2 years ago when Harriet told Thomas Dalton his land was worthless," he said. "And I didn't say anything. I had my reasons, and they were practical reasons, and I've thought about them since, and I don't entirely like the way they reflect on me." He said it plainly, without the particular performance of self-flagellation that some men use to make themselves seem humble. So that's a part of it. She absorbed that. It was more honesty than she'd expected, and more complicated, and she didn't quite know what to do with it. "I need to look at that survey amendment," she said. "I thought you might. Can you get me access to it?" "I can do better than that," he said. "I had my cousin make a copy." He pulled a folded set of papers from inside his jacket and held them out over the fence rail. She crossed to the fence and took them and unfolded them. The handwriting was old, cramped, meticulous in the way of men who considered legibility a moral virtue. She read through the survey amendment slowly, her finger tracing the property lines, the notations in the margins, the small careful mark that indicated a subsurface water feature on the east ridge at a depth that was noted as approximately 8 to 12 feet below grade. 8 to 12 feet, she'd pressed her palm against that ground and felt the logic of water at 8 feet down. "This is real," she said quietly. "It's real. Thomas needs to know about this before Harriet's petition goes through. Thomas also needs someone to document the current state of that water source," Colt said. "The commission will require evidence, survey notes, water testing, documentation of the subsurface access point. It's not enough to have the old amendment that just proves the feature exists. You'd need to prove it's viable and accessible. Otherwise, Harriet's lawyers will argue it's historical notation for a depleted resource. How long would that documentation take? Done properly?" he considered. 6 weeks minimum. You'd need someone with survey credentials to sign off on it. "Do you know someone?" "I might." He was watching her steadily. "I also know that word of what we're doing would get back to Harriet within days if we're not careful about who we involve. She has people at the commission office, and she has people at every ranch in this valley who owe her favors. So we work quietly, he agreed. She refolded the papers and held them against her chest for a moment, thinking. Then something else occurred to her, something she probably should have thought of sooner, but hadn't, because she'd been so focused on the mechanics of the water situation, that she'd let herself forget a basic principle. "Why do you trust me?" she asked. He blinked. It was the first time she'd seen him look anything approaching surprised. "What? You're sharing information that could cause real damage if it went the wrong direction. You've known me for a week. You've seen me carry pots and talk back to Harriet Boone at a dinner party." She met his eyes. "That's not a lot of evidence to operate on." He was quiet for a moment in a way that felt like he was actually weighing the question rather than reaching for an easy answer. "You walked that east ridge," he said finally. "In the first week you were here. I saw you. I was moving cattle along the north fence line, and I had a clear view across the property. You spent 2 hours on that ridge, going slow, crouching down and pressing your hands to the ground." He paused. "Nobody does that who doesn't know how to read land. And nobody reads land that carefully who doesn't care about it." She looked at him. "Also," he added, with that almost not a smile of his, "you had mud on your hands the morning after the gathering, which means you were back out there before 6 in the morning." He lifted one shoulder. "People who are lying low don't get up before 6 to examine creek beds." She wanted to say something sharp and deflecting. She found she didn't. "I need to tell Thomas," she said instead. "He's not going to take it well." "No." but he needs to know what he has before someone takes it from him. The conversation with Thomas Dalton happened that evening at the kitchen table after supper with the survey amendment papers spread out between them and May Sutton, pointedly finding reasons to wash things on the far side of the kitchen so she could stay in the room. Thomas listened with the expression of a man being told about a medical diagnosis he'd been half expecting and dreading, not exactly shock, more a kind of grim recognition, like pieces of something he'd known, but not understood, were finally arranging themselves into a shape. He was silent for a long time after Eliza finished. "She's been doing this since Edna died," he said finally. "Edna had been his wife. I didn't see it that clearly then. I thought she was just opportunistic, the way Harriet always is." He rubbed his face with both hands, a gesture of exhaustion so total, it made him look 10 years older for the duration of it. "An underground water source on the East Ridge," Eliza said. "The survey amendment confirms it, and based on what I've observed of the soil conditions, it's viable. How do we prove that to the commission? Colt Mercer knows a surveyor who can document it officially, but it needs to happen quickly and quietly. If Harriet learns what we're doing before we have the documentation complete, she'll find a way to complicate it." Thomas looked at her across the papers. He had the look of a man who has been surprised by competence arriving from an unexpected direction and isn't quite sure how to receive it with grace. "You figured all this out in 3 months," he said. It wasn't accusatory, it was almost wondering. "I've been paying attention," she said. He nodded slowly. He picked up the survey amendment and held it the way people hold documents they can't quite believe are real, carefully, at a slight distance, as if he needed his eyes to confirm what his hands were already telling him. "I'll need to pay Mercer something for this," he said. "For his help. Talk to him about that," Eliza said. "He's not doing it for nothing, but I don't think money is the primary thing he's after." Thomas gave her a look that was more perceptive than she'd credited him with. "What is he after?" She picked up the papers and began refolding them. "I think he's after making sure Harriet Boone doesn't win," she said, "which is a goal I happen to share. Word travels in small towns the way water travels downhill, not always fast, but always eventually, finding every crack and channel available." By the following Monday, something had shifted in the way Red Hollow treated Eliza Vance's presence at the Dalton Ranch, though the shift was subtle enough that she might have missed it if she hadn't been watching for it. The feed store started filling her orders without the particular delay that had characterized her previous visits, the way Aldis's assistant would go to the back to check stock and return 8 minutes later, with things that had clearly been sitting on the shelf. The woman at the dry goods counter, Mrs. Haverford, who had previously offered the minimal acknowledgement of the professionally courteous, actually made a comment about the weather in a tone that invited response. Small things. The kind of things that meant nothing individually and everything collectively. Colt had warned her that news of what they were doing would travel. She hadn't expected the travel to begin before they'd done anything visible. She understood it, though, when she thought it through. Colt Mercer had sat at the serving table with her at the gathering. In a town like Red Hollow, that gesture hadn't landed quietly. People had been watching Colt Mercer for years, waiting to see which direction he pointed, because he was the kind of man who didn't move without reason, and whose reasons tended to be worth paying attention to. When he sat down beside her, he'd told every person in that room something he hadn't said in words. "This one is worth something." And people in Red Hollow, whatever their individual feelings about Harriet Boone or Thomas Dalton or the social order in general, responded to Colt Mercer's assessments. It made her uncomfortable in a way she couldn't entirely articulate. She hadn't wanted anyone to vouch for her. She'd wanted to demonstrate her own value on her own terms. But the world was the world, and not what she wanted it to be, and she was practical enough to accept that the shift in social temperature, whatever its cause, made certain parts of what she needed to do easier. She met with Colt again that Thursday, at the edge of the Dalton property where it met the county road, in the early morning before either of their days had properly started. He brought the name of the surveyor, a man named Aldis Webb, who worked out of Sutter Creek and had no professional or personal ties to the Boone family. She knew the name distantly from a conversation she'd overheard at the dry goods store months ago. Webb was said to be thorough and slow and constitutionally opposed to shortcuts. "He'll want to do this right," Colt said, "which means he'll take the time it takes and he won't cut corners to accommodate a deadline. Can he make the commission's filing window? If we start him on the property by next week, he has time." "Barely. Then we start him next week." Colt looked at her with a particular expression, assessing, but not in the way that felt like judgment. More like recalibration. Thomas agreed to all of this? "Thomas is scared," she said, "but he's not stupid. He understands what losing the ranch means." She paused. "He also knows that if this goes right, he has an asset he didn't know he had." The underground source isn't just defensive, it's something he could use. Develop, maybe offer access to neighboring properties. You've been thinking about the bigger picture, haven't you? She could see that. He was the kind of man who thought in systems, not just the immediate problem, the conditions that created it, and the downstream consequences of any given solution. She was the same way, and recognizing that quality in another person produced an odd double effect, reassurance and wariness in equal measure. People who think in systems can be trusted to think ahead. They can also be trusted to have agendas that go further than they've stated. She didn't know what his agenda was beyond what he'd told her. She filed that uncertainty away rather than resolving it prematurely. The next 2 weeks were among the most relentless she'd spent since arriving in Red Hollow. Aldewebs came to the property on a Monday with his equipment and his methodical temperament and began the documentation process with the unhurried precision of a man who understood that accuracy is worth more than speed. Eliza worked alongside him, not because he needed her to, but because she needed to understand what he was finding, and because the East Ridge was her territory in a way she couldn't have explained rationally. She'd walked it enough times that she knew where the ground changed underfoot, knew which patches ran wet and which ran dry, knew the 3 spots where the grasses grew thick and green in defiance of the dry season. On the second day, Webb found what she'd expected him to find. He sank a test probe at the location she'd identified and hit water at 9 feet. He stood up and looked at her with the expression of a man who has just been asked to recalibrate his opinion of someone. "You identified this location from surface observation," he said. "Yes, before I ran the probe." He looked at the probe. He looked at her. He said, in a way that contained a great deal of information, and went back to taking notes. She walked back to the barn that evening with the particular bone-deep tiredness that comes not from physical labor but from sustained concentration, the kind where every faculty you have has been operating at full stretch for hours, and the relief of stopping is almost physical. She sat on a hay bale and put her head back against the barn wall and closed her eyes for a moment. The sound of hoofbeats in the yard brought her back. She recognized the rhythm, the particular gait of Colt's gray horse, which was a big animal with a distinctive even tread that she'd learned to identify without looking. She went to the barn door. He was coming from the road, and even at a distance she could read the quality of his movement, not casual, not the loose-shouldered ease of a man arriving with good news. He was riding with purpose, which meant something had happened. "Webb, find anything?" he called as he came into the yard. "Water at 9 feet, she said, exactly where the survey note said. Something in him relaxed fractionally, the way a muscle releases when a threat passes. "Good, because we may need that documentation sooner than we thought." He dismounted and led the gray to the hitching post. His jaw was tight. Harriet moved up her timeline. "What do you mean?" "The commission agreed to hear her petition at an emergency session. 2 weeks from Thursday." He turned to face her. Aldous pushed for it. "He's on the commission board. I should have seen that coming, and I didn't." Eliza's mind ran the numbers immediately. 2 weeks from Thursday. Webb had estimated 6 weeks for full documentation. They had at best 12 days before the hearing. "Can Webb accelerate?" I asked him on the way here. "He says he can produce a preliminary assessment in 12 days if he works without interruption. It won't be as complete as he'd want, but it'll be documentable and defensible." Colt's voice was measured, but she could hear the strain underneath it. "Question is whether the commission will accept a preliminary assessment as grounds to delay the ruling on Harriet's petition. Who on the commission board is likely to be persuadable? Possibly 2 of the 5. Harriet has the other 3, including Aldous. Then we need more than Webb's assessment," Eliza said. She was already thinking, the kind of fast lateral thinking that she'd always done slightly shamefully, as though thinking quickly were something she was supposed to apologize for. "We need community interest. If other ranch families in the valley understand that this water source has implications for regional water access, not just the Dalton property, then the commission has political pressure to consider, not just one family's petition." Colt looked at her steadily. "You're talking about making this public." "I'm talking about making the right facts available to the right people before the commission makes a decision that can't be undone." She met his eyes. "The Kelsey family is struggling with their wells. So is Frank Drum. If there's a viable underground source on this ridge, the geology suggests it may extend further along the valley floor than just the Dalton property. Webb would know." "Webb thinks it's possible," Colt said. "He mentioned it on the first day. The formation he's finding is consistent with a larger subsurface feature. Then the Kelsey and Drum families have an interest in this outcome," she said. "And so does anyone else in this valley who's been watching their wells drop through the dry summer." She paused. "Harriet has 3 votes on the commission. She can't easily hold those votes if half the town is standing outside asking questions. Colt looked at her for a long, measured moment. When he spoke again, his voice had a different quality, not uncertain, but careful in a way that told her he was about to say something he'd been turning over for a while. You know that if you do this, if you push this into the open, and it becomes a public fight instead of a private documentation process, Harriet is going to come after you specifically. Not Thomas, not me, you. His voice was level and he wasn't softening it. She'll dig into where you came from. She'll look for anything she can use. Whatever you're running from, she'll find it. The barn was very quiet. The horses breathed in their stalls. Somewhere out past the fence, a coyote called once and went silent. Eliza felt the weight of the worn suitcase that sat on the windowsill in her room. The papers inside it, the photograph, the letter in its worn soft folds. The secret that she'd carried 3 counties east and hadn't let follow her, hadn't let become part of the story she was building here. She thought about it for a moment. Genuinely thought about it, not the performance of weighing options, but the actual, uncomfortable calculation of risk. What she stood to lose, what this valley stood to lose if Harriet Boone's petition went through unchallenged. I know, she said, and the Kelsey family has 3 kids and their south well ran dry in August. She looked at him. What's Frank Drum's situation? Colt was quiet for another moment. Then he said, Frank's been hauling water from town twice a week since July. His wife doesn't know how bad it is. He hasn't told her. Eliza nodded. Then we talked to Frank and the Kelseys, she said, quietly this week, before we decide anything public. He held her gaze for a moment longer, and she had the sense that he was looking for something, some crack in the steadiness of what she'd just said, some indication that she hadn't fully understood what she was agreeing to. He didn't find it, she thought, because it wasn't there. She'd understood. All right, he said finally. He stayed another half hour, standing in the yard while she leaned against the fence rail, and they talked through logistics, who to approach first, how to frame the conversation, what information to share, and in what order. The night air was cool and smelled of dry grass and coming autumn, and the stars were the particular sharp brightness of high-altitude clear nights. And somewhere in the dark field beyond the fence, the horses grazed and moved with their quiet, patient purpose. She watched him ride out and stood for a moment in the yard after he'd gone, listening to the sound fade. She went back inside. She sat on the edge of her bed. She looked at the worn suitcase on the windowsill for a long time, in the way you look at something you've been keeping at a careful distance, and can feel yourself moving closer to. She didn't open it. She lay down and looked at the ceiling and thought about Frank Drum's wife, who didn't know how bad the water situation was. About the Kelsey children. About Thomas Dalton holding the survey amendment at a distance, like a document that might rescind itself if handled too roughly. About Harriet Boone, who had been planning this for years with the patience of someone who believes inevitability is on their side. She thought about Colt Mercer, saying she'll find it with that steady voice that didn't try to make the truth softer than it was. She thought, let her find it then, and was surprised by how much she meant it. Because the thing about carrying a secret is that it has weight, and weight is tiring, and she had been tired for a long time. Tired in a way that the work hadn't cured, and the distance hadn't cured, and the careful invisibility she'd maintained for 3 months hadn't come close to touching. There was a version of what was happening in this valley where Eliza Vance kept her head down and let Harriet Boone have her petition and moved on before the cost of staying got too high. She knew that version. She'd lived versions of it before. She knew exactly how it felt in the morning and how it felt 10 years later and how her mother had felt living it her whole life. Closed her eyes. Outside the ranch breathed in the dark the horses, the fence lines, the east ridge with its hidden water moving patient and purposeful 9 feet below the surface, carrying its weight in silence the way it had for 30 years, waiting for someone to find it and say, this is real. This matters. This belongs to something. She thought she understood that in a way she couldn't have explained to anyone without giving too much of herself away. She slept. Frank Drum lived 6 miles south of the Dalton property on a stretch of land that had been good once and was still trying. His barn needed paint. His fence lines were holding but only just. The kind of place that looked, from the road, like a man who was managing and looked, up close, like a man who was managing by not thinking too hard about the things that were slipping. Eliza rode out to see him on a Wednesday morning, alone, without telling Thomas Dalton where she was going. She'd considered bringing Colt and decided against it. Frank Drum was 61 years old and had the particular pride of a man who has done things his own way for 4 decades, and arriving with Colt Mercer beside her would change the geometry of the conversation before it started. 2 people carrying information feels like an intervention. 1 person feels like a neighbor stopping by. She found him in the yard behind the house, repairing a section of gutter that had pulled away from the eave in the last rain. He came down from the ladder when he heard her horse and stood there squinting at her in the morning light with the expression of a man trying to place a face he's seen once. "Eliza Vance," she said. "I work the Dalton place." "I know who you are," he said, not unfriendly, just factual. He was a compact man with gray in his beard and hands that looked like they'd been worked hard since before she was born. "What brings you out this direction?" "I wanted to talk to you about your water situation," she said. "If you have a few minutes." Something moved through his face that he controlled quickly, the flicker of a man who has been carrying a private fear and isn't prepared for someone to name it in the open air. "What water situation?" he said, flat, a statement pretending to be a question. She kept her voice even. "The south well that's been running low since July. The twice-weekly hauls from town." She paused. "I'm not here to tell you your business, Mr. Drum. I'm here because I found something on the Dalton property that might matter to you. And I thought you deserved to know about it before certain other people in this county use it to their advantage instead of yours." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Come inside. Margaret's got coffee on." Margaret Drum was 70, small, sharp-eyed, and had clearly not been told about the twice-weekly water hauls. She set cups on the table with the fluid efficiency of a woman who had managed a ranch household for decades and poured coffee without asking, and then sat down herself with her own cup, which told Eliza that whatever her husband had thought this conversation would be, his wife had already decided she was staying for it. Eliza laid it out as plainly as she could, the survey amendment. The subsurface water feature on the East Ridge, what Aldous Webb had found at 9 feet. The geological formation Webb had described a sedimentary shelf that extended, in his preliminary assessment, northeast along the valley floor for a distance that would put it under portions of at least 3 adjacent properties. The Boone petition. The emergency commission session. Frank listened without interrupting, which was rarer than it should have been. Margaret listened with her hands wrapped around her coffee cup, and her face went through several things while Eliza talked recognition, and then anger, and then a particular set quality around the jaw that Eliza recognized as the expression of someone who has just understood that a situation they thought was bad luck is actually something that was done to them. "She knew," Margaret said when Eliza finished. "Harriet Boone knew about this formation when she started pushing for the diversion claim." "Almost certainly," Eliza said. Margaret set her cup down. "She knew our wells were affected by the same system, and she let us haul water all summer without saying a word." Her voice was very quiet, the kind of quiet that is the opposite of calm. Frank said nothing. He was looking at the table with the expression of a man counting the cost of something. "I'm not asking you to do anything you're not comfortable with," Eliza said. "I'm asking if you'd be willing to let Webb come and verify whether the formation extends under your property. That's all. The documentation could be useful at the commission hearing. It turns this from a dispute between the Dalton Ranch and Harriet Boone into a regional water access question, which is a different kind of hearing than the one Harriet is planning for." Frank looked up. "And if Webb finds what you think he'll find, then you have documentation of a viable subsurface water source on your property, regardless of what happens at the commission," she said. "That's yours. It doesn't depend on any outcome we can't control." The silence stretched long enough that Margaret reached across the table and put her hand over Frank's. He looked at his wife, and something passed between them that had the weight of shared years and shared difficulty and a shared relief at finally having both of them in the same room with the same information. "Send Webb when he's ready," Frank said. She rode to the Kelsey place in the afternoon. That conversation was shorter and harder. Jim Kelsey was 38 and frightened in the specific way of a younger man who has borrowed to build something and is watching the conditions of the loan change. His wife, Ada, had 3 children underfoot and a 4th due in the spring, and she sat at the edge of the conversation with the focused attention of a woman evaluating the stability of the ground she was standing on. Jim agreed to let Webb survey, but his agreement had the quality of a man saying yes because he couldn't think of a good reason to say no, rather than because he'd fully understood and chosen. Eliza accepted that. It was enough. She rode back to the Dalton Ranch as the sun was going down, cutting orange and rust across the hills, and her back ached from the day's riding, and her mind was running the commission calculations again. 5 board members, 3 potentially in Harriet's pocket, 2 persuadable, and now the possibility of presenting the hearing as a regional matter rather than a property dispute. It wasn't enough. She knew it wasn't enough. 2 persuadable votes plus the weight of community interest might shift the optics of the hearing, but wouldn't guarantee an outcome, not if Aldous had the procedural machinery running in Harriet's favor before the session even opened. She needed something else. She just didn't know yet what it was. Colt was waiting at the Dalton yard when she came in. He'd been there long enough that Thomas had apparently put him to work. He was replacing a section of fence post near the barn with the unhurried efficiency of a man who finds idle waiting less tolerable than physical labor. He looked up when she rode in and read her face the way he'd been reading things from a distance all along. Drum and Kelsey, he said. Both agreed to let Webb survey. She dismounted and began loosening the saddle. Drum's wife is furious. Kelsey's scared. Neither of those is a bad starting position. There's something you need to see, he said. He set down the post driver and pulled a folded paper from his jacket. He seemed to carry things in that jacket the way other people carry things in filing cabinets. Always the right document at the right moment, which she'd stopped finding surprising. He held it out. She took it, unfolded it. Read. It was a letter. Typed on commission stationery, addressed to Thomas Dalton and dated 4 days ago. It informed Mr. Dalton that a preliminary water access review had been initiated on the Upper Creek tributary adjacent to his eastern property boundary, and that he was invited to attend an information session at the commission office at his convenience prior to the formal hearing. Thomas got this 4 days ago, Colt said. He put it in a drawer. She looked up. He didn't tell me. He didn't tell me either. I found it when I came to talk to him this morning, and he had the drawer open looking for something else. Colt's voice was even, but there was something in it that wasn't quite contained. Eliza, the letter is dated 4 days ago. The emergency session is 10 days from now. They sent this to Thomas as a formality, a check the box, so they can say he was notified. They're not expecting him to show up and make arguments. They're expecting him to not fully understand what the letter means until it's already decided. She looked at the letter again. The language was bureaucratic, dense, deliberately unalarming, the kind of writing designed to be technically informative and practically incomprehensible. This is the notice period, she said. 6 business days, he confirmed. The minimum required, starting from the date on the letter, which meant they had less time than she'd calculated. Not 10 days, effectively 7, accounting for the days already elapsed and the business day calculation. She handed the letter back and stood very still for a moment, the way she did when she needed to let her mind work without her body creating interference. 7 days. Webb needed 12 for a full assessment and had committed to a preliminary in 12 days. A preliminary in 7 was possible, but not comfortable, and Aldous Webb had already made clear his opinions about uncomfortable shortcuts. Can Webb prioritize the Dalton East Ridge, she said. Just that location, just the documentation needed to establish the primary source claim. Leave the extended formation for later, I can ask him. Ask him tonight. She turned toward the house. I need to talk to Thomas. Thomas Dalton was in the kitchen, and May Sutton was there too, and the letter was apparently now on the table between them because May had apparently had the same reaction. Colt had to learning it had been sitting in a drawer for 4 days. Thomas looked like a man who had been talked to already and was bracing for more. Eliza sat down. She did not lead with the drawer. That was done and couldn't be undone, and dwelling on it would just make Thomas more defensive and less functional, which was the opposite of what she needed. Here's what I need from you, she said. A written statement documenting your awareness of the survey amendment and your assertion of property rights to the subsurface feature. Dated today, signed and witnessed. She looked at him. Can you write that tonight? Yes. He straightened slightly, the way people do when given a concrete task in the middle of confusion. May can witness it. Good. I also need you to formally request that the commission hearing be classified as an open session rather than an administrative review. You have the right to request that as an affected party. It changes who can attend and what kind of testimony is admissible. Thomas blinked. How do you know that? Because I spent 2 evenings this week reading the County Water Commission procedural code at the public library in Sutter Creek, she said. The classification request has to be filed in writing by an affected party at least 5 business days before the session, which means you need to file it tomorrow morning. May Sutton made a sound from the far side of the kitchen that might have been satisfaction. Thomas looked at Eliza across the table for a long, unguarded moment. He looked, she thought, like a man who has been trying to run a race alone for years and has just realized he's been allowed to have help and doesn't quite know how to accept it without feeling diminished by it. I'll write both letters tonight, he said. You'll need to tell me the exact language for the classification request. I have it, she said. I wrote it out this afternoon. She had in a notebook in her room during the 20 minutes she'd had between returning from the Kelsey place and Colt's arrival. She'd drafted it in the library in Sutter Creek and refined it on the ride home, working through the language in her head while the horse found his way along the familiar road. This was not a skill she'd invented in Red Hollow. This was something she'd learned years ago. In circumstances, she didn't talk about the particular competence of understanding how systems worked, how documents moved through bureaucratic channels, how language in official contexts could be a weapon or a shield depending on how it was shaped. She'd learned it in a situation where she'd needed it and hadn't had it yet, and the learning had cost her something she couldn't get back, and she'd carried the knowledge forward like something that had been paid for and therefore couldn't be wasted. She handed Thomas the notebook page with the classification request language. He read it slowly. His lips moved slightly on the technical phrases, the way people do when they're reading something dense. Then he looked up. "This is good," he said, with a plainness that was more valuable to her than effusion. "This is really good." She nodded, said nothing. The thing she felt was not pride, exactly more like the satisfaction of a tool being used correctly after a long time of sitting unused. Webb arrived at the Dalton property the next morning at first light, having been contacted by Colt the previous evening, and having, after what Colt described as a significant negotiation, agreed to prioritize the East Ridge documentation. He was not happy about the compressed timeline. He communicated his unhappiness in the particular way of meticulous men, which was to say nothing about it directly, but to be extremely precise about every step of the process, in a way that made clear he considered precision to be the only adequate response to being rushed. He worked for 4 days without significant pause. Eliza stayed close, not hovering. She'd learned early that Webb did not respond well to hovering but available, answering questions about surface conditions, pointing out features she'd noted in her own months of observation. On the second day, he found the secondary pressure point she'd suspected existed approximately 30 feet north of the primary probe location, which confirmed the formation was extensive and not a localized pocket. On the third day, he took water samples and sent them to a testing facility in Sutter Creek via Colt's cousin at the county office, who apparently had a broader set of professional obligations than just pulling land surveys. On the fourth day, Webb sat at Thomas Dalton's kitchen table and produced a preliminary assessment document that was 11 pages long, single-spaced, with 3 hand-drawn diagrams and a table of water pressure measurements. He read sections of it aloud to Thomas and Eliza and Colt, who had arrived that morning, and installed himself at the kitchen table, as though he'd always sat there, and May Sutton, who had long since abandoned any pretense of not being directly involved in the proceedings. The document established, in the careful language of professional survey documentation, the existence of a viable subsurface water feature on the Dalton property's eastern ridge at a depth of 9 feet, with a secondary pressure point indicating formation extent consistent with a larger regional feature, preliminary water quality within acceptable parameters for both agricultural and domestic use, and a historical notation in the 1871 survey amendment confirming the feature's documented existence prior to any competing claims. It was not the full assessment Webb had wanted to produce, but it was real, documented, signed, and defensible. "Will hold up?" Colt asked. Webb looked at him with the expression of a man whose professional honor has been lightly questioned. "Everything I put my name to holds up," he said. "The preliminary notation means it's subject to expansion with further data, but the core findings are supported by the evidence gathered. No commission can dismiss this without dismissing my methodology, and my methodology has been accepted in 17 county proceedings in 4 states. "Good enough," Colt said. Thomas filed the open session classification request the morning after Eliza had produced the draft. The commission received it, processed it in the legally required time frame, and responded with confirmation that the hearing would be conducted as an open session, which meant community members could attend and submit written testimony, which meant the room would not just be 5 board members and Harriet Boone's lawyers. Eliza found out about Harriet's response through May Sutton, who had a network of information sources that operated through channels Eliza didn't fully understand and had stopped trying to map. Clara Finch came into the dry goods store this morning furious, May reported, without looking up from the bread she was shaping. Buying things she didn't need and talking too loud about how some people in this county don't understand how water law works. She paused. "She mentioned your name twice, not kindly. She rarely mentions anyone's name kindly," Eliza said. "She said you've been feeding misinformation to the farming families in the valley." May pressed the bread dough with practiced efficiency. "Said you don't understand the hydrology and you're raising false hopes." She paused again. "She said a few other things I won't repeat because they reflect more on her than on you." Eliza was quiet for a moment. She'd been expecting something like this, since Colt had warned her that going public would draw Harriet's attention toward her specifically. She'd prepared for it in the abstract. The reality of it, the specific knowledge that her name was being used in a store she had to visit every Thursday, that her credibility was being worked at while she was standing in this kitchen, shaping the situation the best she could. The reality of it was different from the abstract. "Did anyone in the store push back?" she asked. May looked up. "Margaret Drum was there," she said. She told Clara Finch to her face that misinformation was a strong word coming from someone who hadn't been hauling water since July. She allowed herself a brief expression that was not quite a smile. Clara left fairly promptly after that. The night before the commission hearing, Eliza couldn't sleep. This wasn't unusual, for her sleep had always been provisional, something she had to negotiate with herself rather than something that came naturally, different from the ordinary watchfulness she'd lived with for years. This was specific. She lay in the narrow bed in her room off the back of the house and stared at the ceiling and went through it again. Methodically, the classification request, the web assessment, the written testimony Frank Drum had submitted, and the written testimony Ada Kelsey had submitted on her husband's behalf, and the 2 other Valley families who had sent written statements after Margaret Drum had spent 4 days talking to people. The stack of documentation Thomas would carry into the commission room the next morning. It was enough. She thought it was enough. She also knew that enough wasn't the same as certain, that Harriet Boone had resources and institutional relationships and a patience refined over decades, and that Burke Aldous on the commission board was going to use every procedural tool available to narrow the scope of what could be considered. She sat up, reached for the lamp, looked at the worn suitcase on the windowsill. She'd been putting off the thing that Colt had warned her about. She'd told herself she was putting it off, because there was always something more immediate to deal with Webb's timeline. Thomas's letters, Frank Drum's survey, Ada Kelsey's written testimony. That was partly true. The other part was that taking out the papers in that suitcase meant making them real again, in a way that 3 months of careful distance had started to blur. She got up, crossed to the window, opened the suitcase. Papers were there where she'd left them. She sorted through them with the detached efficiency of a woman handling documents rather than the artifacts of her own life. Birth record her mother's name, her father's name, which was the name of a man she'd never met and didn't intend to. Court document, 3 pages, with her name on it, and a case number and language that was legally precise and personally devastating. A letter from a man named Howard Bess written 8 months ago, which she'd read enough times to have memorized and still hadn't been able to bring herself to destroy. She read Howard Bess's letter again in the lamplight. He had been her employer, 2 towns east of where she'd grown up, a man who ran a small land management office and had hired her 3 years ago when she was 24 and had already demonstrated the particular competence with records and land documents that made her useful to someone who needed someone useful. She'd worked for him for 2 years and done her job well, and had believed, for most of those 2 years, that she was simply an employee, and he was simply an employer, and the arrangement was professional. She had been wrong about that. The letter was an ultimatum, dressed in the language of concern. It told her, in the careful way of a man who has thought about how to say a thing without saying it directly, that her continued independence was conditional on her silence about a set of transactions she had accidentally uncovered in the land records during the 2nd year of her employment. Transactions that were not legal. Transactions that involved the fraudulent recording of water access rights on behalf of a network of landowners who paid Howard Bess for the service. Transactions that looked, when you read them carefully, very similar to what Harriet Boone was attempting to do through the commission in Red Hollow. She had left. She hadn't gone to anyone with what she knew not then, because she hadn't understood the full shape of it. And not later, because by the time she understood it, she was 3 counties away, and the court document in the suitcase was 2 months old, and she was trying to survive. Court document was a civil judgment. Howard Bess had filed a breach of contract claim against her when she left, on the grounds that she had taken confidential client files. She hadn't taken client files, she'd taken her own work notes, which she'd needed to prove to herself what she'd seen. The judgment had gone against her in a proceeding she hadn't been present for, because she'd already left the county, because Howard Bess had timed the filing to the week she'd gone. The judgment wasn't criminal, it was civil. It couldn't be enforced across county lines without significant legal effort, and Howard Bess, despite everything, was a man who avoided official attention. But it existed, and if Harriet Boone found it, she'd have a document with Eliza Vance's name on it and the word judgment in the header, and she would use it in the commission room to make Webb's assessment look like the product of someone with a legal cloud over her. Eliza put the papers back, closed the suitcase, sat on the edge of the bed in the lamplight and thought. She could tell Colt. She'd been almost telling him for days at the property line, at the kitchen table, in the barnyard when he'd said she'll find it, and she'd said let her, which had been brave and had also been somewhat reckless. She hadn't told him because the particular arithmetic of trust is complicated when you're carrying something that could damage the situation you're both trying to build, and she hadn't known how much weight his trust could hold. She thought about the way he'd sat at the serving table in the Grange Hall, the plate and the fork and the simple, complete decision of it. She thought about the moment at the East Ridge fence when he'd said, "You're the one working that land every day," as though that fact alone were sufficient recommendation. She thought about, she'll find it said with no judgment and no rescue, just information delivered to someone he apparently believed could handle it. She put out the lamp, lay back down. The storm came in the small hours of the morning, as storms in that country often do without the courtesy of gradual arrival, just a sudden shift in the air and then the full weight of it. Rain drove against the window hard enough to rattle the frame. Thunder came in sequences that overlapped each other before the first one had finished, which meant the cell was almost directly overhead. The horses were restless. She could hear them moving in the barn, the muffled sounds of large animals uncomfortable in the dark. She got up and dressed and went to check on them, because that was what you did. The rain hit her the moment she opened the back door, cold and direct, soaking through her jacket before she'd crossed the yard. She got into the barn and stood inside the door for a moment, dripping, letting her eyes adjust. The horses were all right scared, but all right. She moved through the stalls, checking water, latching anything that had come loose, speaking in the low continuous murmur she used with them, which was wordless really, just tone and steadiness, communication of an animal to an animal that says, "I'm here, I know, it's loud, we're okay." She was in the barn when the lightning hit the East Ridge. She didn't see it, she was inside, but she heard it. The crack and boom arriving almost simultaneously, which meant it was close, and she felt the concussive pressure of it even through the barn walls. The horses screamed. She moved fast through the stalls with her hands on each animal's neck in turn, talking them down, and when they'd settled to shivering, she went to the barn door and looked out. The East Ridge was dark. The lightning had left no fire, the rain was too heavy for that. But in the next flash of light, she could see something that had not been there yesterday. Where the ground had been flat at the top of the ridge, there was now a depression, a collapse, maybe 6 feet across, where the surface had given way. She stared at it through the rain and the intermittent lightning and understood what she was looking at. The water pressure below the ridge elevated by the seasonal rain, by the collection of recent wet weeks, by the compressed condition of the sedimentary shelf Webb had documented had shifted. The surface over the access point had collapsed inward. Not catastrophically, not a sinkhole, but an exposure. The underground water feature had, in the most literal possible way, revealed itself. She was still standing in the barn door looking at it when Colt rode into the yard at full speed from the north, his gray horse dark with rain, and pulled up hard at the barn and swung down before the horse had fully stopped. "The ridge," he said. "I saw it," she said. He came to stand beside her in the barn door, and they looked at it together in the rain and the lightning intervals, the dark depression in the East Ridge that had not been there yesterday morning. In the morning, it would need to be documented. In the morning, Webb would need to come back with different instruments, because what had been a subsurface feature confirmed by probe was now a visible surface phenomenon that changed the evidentiary situation completely. "The hearing is tomorrow," Colt said. "Yes," she said. The rain came down between them and the ridge, straight and heavy, and without mercy. Somewhere in the valley, she knew, the Kelsey family yard was filling with water. Frank Drum's south well was probably running cleaner than it had in months, the pressure system activated by the same storm that had just opened the earth on this ridge. She thought about the commission room tomorrow, about Burke Aldis and his carefully managed procedural control, about Harriet Boone sitting somewhere on her 3,000 acres tonight, dry and certain, having planned for years and feeling the shape of her plan closing. She thought about what a surface collapse at the ridge location would mean for Webb's preliminary assessment, the way it transformed a documented claim into a visible physical fact that anyone standing on the property could look at. "Will Webb come tonight?" she said. Colt looked at her sideways. "I'll ask him. We need photographs, documentation of the exposure before the hearing opens." She turned from the doorway. "I need to write down exactly what I observed and when. Time conditions what I saw, Eliza." His voice made her stop. She turned. He was looking at her with that quality of attention, rain running from the brim of his hat. "Whatever Harriet finds," he said. "Whatever she brings into that room tomorrow. I need you to know that I'm not going to step back from it." She looked at him for a long moment in the dark barn doorway, with the rain coming down, and the horses breathing behind her, and the East Ridge sitting open against the sky. "You don't know what she might find," she said. "No," he said. "I don't, and I'm telling you anyway." The rain drove against the barn roof in the steady percussion of a storm that had settled in for the night. She held his gaze and felt the particular weight of a moment when something you've been holding at careful distance moves close enough to touch, and you have to decide whether to step back or stand still. She stood still. "Webb needs to come tonight," she said. "We can talk about the rest after the hearing." He held her gaze another second, then nodded once, and turned back toward his horse. She watched him mount and ride back into the rain toward the north, the gray shape of horse and rider dissolving into the dark and the weather, and then she went inside to write down everything she'd observed in a hand that was steadier than she felt, because there was work to do, and the storm was not finished, and neither were any of them. Webb arrived at the Dalton property at midnight. He came in a wagon rather than on horseback, because he needed his instruments, and the rain made the road slow, and he arrived with his coat soaked through, and his expression conveying the specific displeasure of a man who respects his work too much to do it poorly, even when he'd rather be asleep. He didn't complain. He asked for a lantern and a second one if available, and Eliza provided both, and they walked out to the East Ridge together through the rain, with Thomas Dalton following behind in his coat and boots, still half asleep, carrying the third lantern. The collapse was visible even in the dark. The ground had opened, in a roughly circular depression approximately 7 feet across, the edges clean and raw where the surface layer had given way. At the bottom of it, maybe 4 feet down from what had been ground level, you could see water catching the lantern light. Not a trickle, a surface. Still water in the depression, fed from below, already beginning to find its level. Webb stood at the edge and looked at it for a long time without speaking. "When did this occur?" he said finally. "Sometime between 11 and midnight," Eliza said. "I heard the lightning strike. I was in the barn with the horses. I came to the door and saw it in the next flash." Webb took out his notebook. He noted the time of her observation, the approximate dimensions of the collapse, the visible water level. He asked Eliza to hold one lantern at a specific angle while he measured depth with a rod he'd brought. He took water from the exposed surface with a collection vial and sealed it. He made 3 sketches from different positions around the perimeter of the depression, each one precise and unhurried despite the rain, because Aldous Webb considered sloppiness a form of dishonesty. Thomas Dalton stood and watched all of this with an expression that kept moving between wonder and something approaching grief, the specific grief of a man seeing too late what he'd had all along. "It's real," he said at one point, "not to anyone in particular." "It's been real for 30 years, Eliza said. "Longer, probably." Webb spent 40 minutes at the site and produced documentation that was, in his professional estimation, sufficient to establish the event as a natural exposure of the previously documented subsurface feature. He said this with the understated precision that characterized everything he said, which meant it was very good news described in the blandest possible register. They walked back to the house, and Webb sat at the kitchen table and wrote his addendum to the preliminary assessment by lamplight, while May Sutton, who had apparently decided that normal sleeping hours did not apply to the current situation, produced coffee and said nothing. The addendum was 2 pages. It described the collapse event, the observed water surface, the collection sample, and the assessment surveyor's professional opinion that the visible exposure was consistent with and confirmatory of all findings in the preliminary document. He handed it to Eliza to read first. She read it twice carefully and handed it to Thomas. Thomas read it once and set it down and rubbed his face. "This changes the hearing," Colt said. He'd come in from the yard while Webb was writing, having apparently tended his horse, and found no reason to ride back into the rain. He stood at the edge of the kitchen with his hat in his hands and his jacket still dripping. They can't argue it's historical notation for a depleted resource. It's not depleted. It's sitting in a hole in the ground at midnight in front of 4 witnesses. 5, May said. She didn't look up from the coffee she was pouring. Something moved through the kitchen that was not quite laughter, but was adjacent to it, a brief relaxation of the specific tension that had been running through all of them for days. Even Webb allowed himself a short exhale that might, under different circumstances, have become a smile. Eliza didn't fully relax. She was glad, genuinely glad, in the relieved physical way that comes when something you've been driving toward arrives. But the hearing was still tomorrow, and Harriet Boone was still Harriet Boone, and Burke Aldous was still on the commission board, and the civil judgment, with Eliza's name on it, was still in the worn suitcase on her windowsill. The collapse had changed the evidentiary picture. It hadn't changed everything else. She slept for 3 hours badly and was up before first light. The commission hearing was held in the county building in Sutter Creek, which was a 40-minute ride from Red Hollow under good conditions and closer to an hour in the thick mud the storm had left behind. Eliza rode with Thomas in the wagon, the documentation in a leather satchel between them, Webb's full package, plus the midnight addendum, plus the written testimonies from Frank Drum and Ada Kelsey and the two other Valley families. Colt rode alongside on the gray. The road was slow and ugly. The wagon wheels cut deep and pulled hard on the uphill sections, and Thomas drove with the focused silence of a man managing a team through difficult ground, which meant he wasn't talking, which Eliza found she was grateful for. She needed the quiet to think. She'd decided, sometime in the 3 hours of bad sleep, that she was going to tell Colt about Howard Bess before they went into the room. Not because she owed him the information, she still wasn't sure about the architecture of what she owed him and what she didn't, but because going into that hearing with a secret that might surface was tactically worse than going in with it already named between them. If Harriet found the judgment and used it, and Colt was surprised by it in the middle of a public proceeding, his surprise would read as doubt, and doubt in that room would be a gift to Harriet's lawyers. She told him at the edge of Sutter Creek, while Thomas was talking to a man he knew near the livery stable. She kept it short and factual. Howard Bess, the fraudulent water rights transactions, her discovery of them, her departure, the civil judgment filed after she'd gone. She said none of it in a way designed to manage his reaction, no softening language, no preemptive framing. Just the shape of what had happened, as clearly as she could state it in the 5 minutes they had. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, watching Thomas across the road. The transactions at Bess's office, he said. What form did they take? She looked at him. She'd expected, she wasn't sure what she'd expected. Not that, they were recorded as survey amendments, she said slowly. Fraudulent ones, filed in batches, attached to legitimate property surveys as though they were corrections. Anyone checking individual parcels wouldn't see the pattern. You'd only see it if you were working with the full filing set. Colt looked at her steadily. That's the same mechanism Harriet used to conceal the 1,871 amendment from Thomas, attaching it to a secondary ledger filed separately from the main property record. She heard what he was saying. You think there's a connection? I think Harriet Boone's grandfather was the county surveyor who filed the original 1,871 amendment, he said. And I think your former employer was using a method that someone in this territory was using before him. He paused. I don't know that they're connected, but the method is specific enough that it's worth asking whether Howard Bess learned it from someone who started here. She stood with that for a moment. It was speculative he'd said so himself. But it had the particular quality of things that are speculative and also possibly true, and it shifted the shape of what the judgment against her might mean if it came out in the hearing. Not just a cloud on her credibility. Potentially a piece of a larger pattern that ran in a direction Harriet Boone would not want examined. If Harriet finds the judgment and uses it, Eliza said carefully, we could turn the question back to how she found it. What resources she used to investigate me and why. That's a risk, he said. She'll be prepared for it. She'll be prepared for us to defend it. She won't be prepared for us to advance it. Colt looked at her for a moment. You want to use the judgment as an opening, instead of letting it be used as a weapon. I want to be in the room with the information instead of being surprised by it, she said. That's all I know yet. The rest depends on what happens in there. He nodded, once, which was, she'd come to understand, the way Colt Mercer said, I'm with you. The commission room was smaller than she'd imagined, a rectangular space, with a long table at the front for the board members, rows of chairs for observers, and the particular institutional smell of old wood and paper that settles into rooms where official things have been happening for decades. It was already half full when they arrived, which surprised her until she recognized faces. Margaret Drum was in the second row, sitting straight-backed with her hands folded. Jim Kelsey was there with Ada, who had apparently arranged childcare and made the 40-minute ride despite being 7 months along. There were others ranchers she recognized from the road and the dry goods store and the periphery of conversations she'd listened to on Thursday mornings. People who had received word, through whatever combination of Margaret Drum's directness and valley-wide anxiety about water, that this hearing was worth attending. Harriet Boone was already seated in the front row to the right, in a charcoal dress that had clearly been chosen for the occasion, with a man beside her who had the compact, expensive look of a lawyer from somewhere larger than Sutter Creek. 2 other men flanked them with papers in their hands. Burke Aldis sat at the commission table in the center seat. He looked at Eliza when she came in, and his expression did the specific thing it always did, the brief flicker of reassessment that men like him perform when they encounter something they've underestimated and don't want to admit it. She met his eyes briefly and looked away and sat down beside Thomas. The hearing opened with procedural language that Aldous delivered with the practiced authority of a man who controls rooms by controlling their tempo. He outlined the nature of the petition, the legal framework under which diversion rights were assessed, the scope of evidence the board would consider. He was thorough, and he was fast, the kind of fast that looks like efficiency and functions as exclusion, moving through the procedural setup before observers have quite understood what's being set aside. Harriet's lawyer presented first. He was good. He was better than good. He was the particular kind of polished that comes from having won the same argument in different rooms, enough times that he no longer needed to think about the structure of it, only the specific local details he needed to insert. He presented the petition with fluency and confidence, establishing the legal basis for the diversion claim, the historical use of the tributary, the Boone family's prior relationship to the water source, and the Commission's authority to grant the claim on the grounds of established senior usage rights. He spent 12 minutes on it, not one word wasted. Aldous looked down the table at the other board members, both of whom were making notes. Then he looked at Thomas, Mr. Dalton. You've submitted documentation as an affected party. Do you wish to present? Thomas stood. He was not a man built for rooms like this. He knew it, and the room knew it, and the knowledge made him stiffer than he was in the yard or the kitchen. But he had something that Harriet's lawyer didn't, which was that every person in those rows of chairs had known Thomas Dalton for years, and most of them respected him in the low-key way you respect someone who has tried to do right by his land and his neighbors without making a production of it. He presented the web assessment clearly, if not gracefully. He referred to the preliminary document. He introduced the midnight addendum and explained the circumstances of the ridge collapse with the factual directness of a man reporting something he'd seen with his own eyes. And he submitted both for board consideration, along with the 1,871 survey amendment and the written testimonies of the Valley families. Aldous looked at the web documents with an expression calibrated to convey thoughtful skepticism. He passed them to the board member on his left, then his right. Harriet's lawyer raised a procedural objection to the midnight addendum on the grounds that it had been produced under compressed timelines and without the standard peer review period. Aldous sustained it, provisionally meaning the addendum could be entered as supplementary rather than primary evidence, which reduced its formal weight without removing it. Eliza watched this and noted it and said nothing. Harriet's lawyer then did what she'd been waiting for. He stood and said, with precisely calibrated regret in his voice, that the board should be aware of certain relevant background information concerning one of the individuals centrally involved in the preparation and promotion of Miss Dalton's documentation. He produced a copy of the civil judgment. He read the relevant portions into the record with the practiced neutrality of a man making something sound worse than he's technically saying. He noted the judgment against Eliza Vance in a land management dispute in a neighboring county. He noted the specific language around the taking of confidential property documents. He suggested carefully that the board consider the possibility that the documentation submitted on behalf of Mr. Dalton had been influenced by an individual with a demonstrated history of improper handling of land and water records. The room was quiet in the particular way of rooms where something has landed. Thomas looked at Eliza. His face had gone stiff and uncertain, the expression of a man who has been trusting someone and has just been handed a reason to doubt and doesn't know yet whether the reason is real. She put her hand briefly on his arm, just a touch, just enough to communicate weight, and stood up. "May I address the board?" she said. Aldous looked at her. Something moved in his eyes that she couldn't entirely read. "You're not a party of record in this proceeding," he said. "Mr. Dalton is," she said. "I'm requesting the opportunity to speak on his behalf with his permission." Thomas said, "You have it." His voice was rough but steady. Aldous conferred briefly with the board member on his right, who was a woman named June Pell that Eliza had researched in the library and knew to be a former school teacher who had been appointed to the board 3 years ago and who had voted against 2 of Harriet's prior commission requests on procedural grounds. June Pell said something in a low voice, and Aldous, with a restraint that told her he didn't like it, nodded. "You may speak," he said. 5 minutes. She had prepared for this. Not the specifics. She hadn't known exactly how the judgment would be used or when, but the shape of the response. She'd prepared it in the 3 hours of bad sleep and the 40-minute wagon ride and the years before she'd come to Red Hollow, because this was not the first time in her life that she'd stood in a room with a document being used against her. She didn't defend the judgment first. That was the instinct to immediately explain, to mitigate, to apologize around the edges of the thing, and she didn't do it because leading with defense meant accepting the frame that had just been laid around her. She addressed the board directly, the document Mr. Boone's counsel, just read into the record, is a civil judgment from a proceeding I was not present for, in a dispute I did not initiate, with a former employer whose business practices I left because I discovered they were fraudulent. She said it plainly without heat. The room was still. Mr. Howard Bess, the plaintiff in that judgment, operated a land management office that filed fraudulent survey amendments on behalf of paying clients amendments that manipulated water access records in ways that benefited those clients at the expense of neighboring property owners. I discovered this in the course of my regular work duties. I left his employ. He filed the judgment after my departure as a mechanism of retaliation and to preemptively discredit me as a witness to what I'd found. Harriet's lawyer started to rise. Aldous held up a hand, which surprised her. I mention this, Eliza continued, not to ask this board to adjudicate that dispute. I mention it because the method Mr. Bess used in his fraudulent filings attaching false survey amendments to legitimate secondary ledgers, separated from main property records, is the same method used to conceal the 1,871 survey amendment on the Dalton property. The amendment that Mr. Webb's assessment confirms. The amendment that documents this community's water heritage. She paused exactly long enough for that to sit in the room. I am asking this board to look at what that amendment says and what Mr. Webb found at 9 feet below the East Ridge and what occurred last night when the surface of that ridge collapsed to reveal water that has been there for over 50 years. I am asking you to consider those facts on their merits, independent of who brought them to your attention. She looked at Aldous directly. And I am asking you to consider whether a diversion rights claim that would cut off surface access to a property containing a verified subsurface water source with demonstrated regional formation implications is properly decided at an emergency session with 6 days' notice to affected parties. She sat down. The room was very quiet. June Pell was writing something. The board member on Aldous's left, a man named Reeves, who owned a small farm operation and had said almost nothing during the proceeding, was looking at the Webb documents with a concentration that had not been there before. Harriet Boone, in the front row, was looking at Eliza with an expression that had shed every layer of the social performance Eliza had seen on her face at the Grange Hall. What was underneath was not rage, it was something colder and more calculating. The expression of a woman rapidly reassessing the conditions of a situation she'd considered controlled. Harriet's lawyer spoke again, smoothly, steering back to procedural grounds. He argued that the geological claims were preliminary and unverified by independent assessment, that the midnight addendum had been produced under conditions that compromised its integrity. The civil judgment raised legitimate questions about the reliability of the documentation's source. He was good at this. She'd known he would be. What he couldn't account for was Margaret Drum standing up from the second row. Margaret Drum did not ask permission. She simply stood and said, in the carrying voice of a woman who has spent 6 decades making herself heard in rooms that weren't built for her, my family has been hauling water since July because our south well has been failing. We were told by the county extension office that our well condition was a local anomaly. We were not told there was a regional water formation on the neighboring property that our situation was directly connected to. I would like to know who decided we didn't need to know that. Aldous said, ma'am, this is not an open comment. You filed this as an open session, June Pell said, not loudly. She was looking at the classification request document. The formal request of an affected party received and confirmed by this board 4 days ago, which means public comment is procedurally available. She looked at Aldous with the particular patience of a former schoolteacher who has seen every variety of deflection and is not moved by any of them. Isn't it? It was not a question. Aldous was quiet for 2 full seconds, which was the longest Eliza had seen him quiet since the proceedings opened. Public comment period will follow the evidentiary presentation, he said. What followed was an hour and 40 minutes that moved with the particular stop-start rhythm of a process being fought over in real time. Harriet's lawyer filed 3 procedural objections, 2 of which Aldous sustained, and 1 of which June Pell challenged on the grounds that it mischaracterized the classification status of the session. Reeves, the quiet board member, asked Webb, who had been sitting in the back row with the patience of a man who has attended many proceedings, and learned that most of them resolved themselves to come forward and explain the geological formation in plain language. Webb did this with the same painstaking thoroughness he brought to everything, including a hand-drawn cross-section diagram he produced from his jacket that showed the formation's probable extent beneath the valley floor. Reeves looked at the diagram for a long time. This runs under the Drum property? In my professional assessment, the formation is consistent with extension in that direction. Yes, Webb said. And the Kelsey place? Reeves looked at Aldous. Something passed between them that Eliza couldn't fully read, but it had the quality of a man reconsidering an allegiance that had not been explicitly discussed, but had been functionally assumed. Public comment period was chaotic in the way that public comment periods usually are, when people have been waiting to speak for longer than they've had the formal opportunity to do it. Frank Drum spoke with the direct brevity of a man who has been privately frightened for months and has run out of patience for being polite about it. Ada Kelsey read a prepared statement in a steady voice that was more effective for being plainly written and clearly felt. Two other ranchers spoke about well conditions they'd noticed across the summer that they'd attributed to drought and were now reconsidering. Clara Finch appeared near the end of the comment period and said several things about the integrity of the documentation process and the qualifications of people advising parties to official proceedings that were aimed directly at Eliza and were delivered with the particular venom of a woman who has been made to feel the shape of her own cruelty in public and has not forgiven the person who made her feel it. Colt, from his chair in the third row, said quietly but audibly, "That's enough, Clara." Clara Finch turned to look at him with an expression that suggested she had several additional things to say on the subject. Then she appeared to recalculate something and sat down. The board recessed to deliberate. 40 minutes, which was either a good sign or a sign that the outcome was complicated to arrive at through the procedural mechanisms available. Eliza sat with Thomas in the hallway outside the room and drank water from a tin cup someone had produced and didn't talk much. Thomas said, "At one point, I should have told you about the letter in the drawer." "Yes," she said. "I thought I don't know what I thought. That it would sort itself out." He turned the tin cup in his hands. "That's been my problem for years, thinking things will sort themselves out." She looked at him. "They sometimes do," she said. "The problem is you can't tell in advance which things those are." He almost smiled. "That's generous. I need you functional and not guilty," she said. "So I'm being accurate rather than generous." The board reconvened. Aldous delivered the result in the language of administrative decisions, which was to say that the result was technically qualified in several ways that softened its edges without changing its substance. Commission was declining to grant the diversion rights petition at this session, on the grounds that the geological documentation submitted by the affected party raised regional water access implications that required independent verification before any surface diversion claim could be assessed. An independent assessment would be commissioned at the county's expense. The petition would be held pending those findings, with a review date set for 90 days. It was not a victory exactly. It was a delay, procedurally the kind of delay that changes everything if you use the time correctly, and changes nothing if you don't. But it was Harriet Boone's petition sitting in a drawer for 90 days, while an independent assessor confirmed what Webb had already found, and 90 days was long enough for the conversation in Red Hollow to change shape. Harriet left the commission room without looking at Eliza. Her lawyer packed his papers. Burke Aldous left through a side door. June Pell, walking past Eliza toward the hallways, stopped for a moment. She was 60-something and had the compact solidity of a woman who had made a life of practical decisions. She looked at Eliza directly. "You prepared well," she said. Classification request was correctly filed. She didn't elaborate. She walked on. Outside the building, in the thin afternoon light that had come through after the storm, the Valla families congregated in the way of people who have been through something together and aren't quite ready to separate. Margaret Drum said something to Frank that made him put his arm around her. Ada Kelsey sat on a wagon bench with her hands in her lap and closed her eyes for a moment, in the particular way of a woman conserving energy she doesn't have enough of. Thomas Dalton stood to the side with his hat in his hands, looking at the ground with an expression that had moved past relief into something more complicated, the look of a man beginning to understand the full weight of what he'd almost lost. Eliza stood near the building's wall, slightly apart, because that was where she'd been standing in relation to things for as long as she could remember. Watching, assessing, present at the edges, Colt came to stand beside her. Not close enough to make a statement of it. Just beside her, the way he'd been beside her from the beginning, with that quality of simple choosing that didn't seem to require explanation or performance. 90 days, he said. Webb does the full assessment, she said. The independent commission assessor will confirm it. Harriet's petition dies in committee, probably, he said. Not pretending certainty, she appreciated that. She'll find another angle, Eliza said. She doesn't stop. No, he agreed, but she's working with less now. The fraud connection you named Bess's methodology and the 1871 amendment. People heard that. People are going to ask questions she doesn't want asked. Eliza looked out at the road leading back toward Red Hollow. The mud was drying in the afternoon sun, the ruts the storm had cut already beginning to crust over. The landscape had the particular washed quality of country after hard weather. Everything sharp-edged and fresh-smelling, the light hitting differently than it had the day before. "I need to tell you something else about Howard Bess," she said. Colt waited. "The records I took when I left weren't just my work notes," she said. She'd thought about this in the commission room during the recess, with Thomas's tin cup of water and the 40 minutes of waiting. She'd decided. "I took copies of 3 of the fraudulent filings, because I knew that without documentation of what I'd seen, no one would have any reason to take my word against his." She paused. "I still have them, in the suitcase." He was quiet for a moment. "Does anyone know that?" Howard Bess suspected it. "That's why he filed the judgment." She looked at him. "The filings document a method. If someone with the right authority chose to compare that method to the suppression of the 1871 amendment on this property, there might be a case worth making. That would require finding someone with the right authority," Colt said carefully. "It would require finding someone who isn't afraid to make Harriet Boone uncomfortable in a larger arena than the Water Commission," she said. "County attorney, possibly, or a state land office investigator. It's a different kind of fight than the commission hearing," he said. "I know." She turned to look at him directly. "I've been carrying those documents for 8 months. I didn't take them to do nothing with them." She paused. "I just needed to be somewhere long enough that it felt worth the risk." He held her gaze. "Is this somewhere long enough?" She thought about the east ridge with the water sitting in the open depression in the dark, catching lantern light. She thought about May Sutton saying 5 in the kitchen at midnight. She thought about the small room off the back of the house where she'd slept for 3 months, and the fence lines she'd repaired in slow circuits, and the horses she knew by name and temperament, and the particular rhythm of each animal's movement. "I think it might be," she said. The afternoon light shifted on the muddy road. Down the street, Margaret Drum had gotten Frank laughing at something. A real laugh, the first one Eliza had seen from him, which changed his whole face. Thomas Dalton was talking to Jim Kelsey with the particular loosening of a man who has been carrying something heavy for years and has just set it down and is still getting used to the absence of the weight. "The suitcase," Colt said. "Yes, we should talk about it properly," he said. "When there's time." "There's time now," she said. "We have a 40-minute ride home, and Thomas drives slow in the mud." Something crossed Colt's face that was more than the almost smile she'd gotten used to, more than the quality of attention that she'd come to understand as his version of warmth. It was the unguarded expression of a man who has been maintaining a careful distance from something and has just decided the distance is no longer necessary. "Then we should get the wagon," he said. She pushed off from the wall. Thomas was already heading toward the livery stable, hat back on, walking with the straightened posture of a man who has somewhere to be. The gray horse was hitched at the post down the street, and her own horse beside it, and the road home was 40 minutes of mud and afternoon light and a conversation that had been accumulating for weeks and was finally about to have room enough to happen. She walked out from the wall into the light, and Colt walked beside her, and neither of them said anything for a moment, and that too was something she'd come to understand about him, that silence between them had never been empty. It had always been the place where the honest things were being decided before anyone had to put them into words. The ride back to Red Hollow took 50 minutes because the road was worse than expected in the low section near the creek crossing, where the storm runoff had deepened the ford, and Thomas had to take the wagon through slowly. Eliza and Colt rode alongside in the shallower water, and they talked not all at once, not in any rush. The way conversations go when 2 people have been thinking the same things in parallel and are finally close enough for the thoughts to connect. She told him about Howard Bess in the full version. Not the 5-minute outline she'd given in Sutter Creek, but the actual shape of it, the 2 years of work, the discovery, what she'd understood and what she hadn't, the night she left. He listened with the quality of attention she'd first noticed across a Grange Hall room 3 months ago and had been trying to accurately assess ever since. She told him about the court document, about the photograph in the suitcase. She didn't tell him everything. There were things that were hers to keep, and she kept them. But she told him enough that the suitcase, as a concept, was no longer a secret standing between them. He told her, in the straightforward way he had, that he'd been at the county records office before the gathering, that he'd pulled surveys not just for the Dalton property, but for the Boone holdings, which was how he'd found the pattern of the separate ledger filings, that he'd been looking because 2 years ago, when Harriet had made her first approach to Thomas about buying the East 40 acres, something in the conversation Colt had witnessed hadn't sat right with him, that he'd been waiting for the right moment and the right person, and hadn't found either until she'd walked into the Grange Hall carrying pots of stew, and said my place is wherever I've earned the right to stand. She looked at him when he said that. That's why you sat down, she said. Partly, he said. Partly I just couldn't stand to watch. The ranch came into view at the end of the road in the late afternoon light, the house, the barn listing slightly to one side, the fence lines running out into the pasture in their slow circuits. The east ridge was visible from the road, and she could see, even from this distance, the darker patch on the slope where the ground had opened in the night. It didn't look like damage, she thought. It looked like the land had finally said something it had been trying to say for a long time. Thomas pulled the wagon into the yard and sat for a moment before getting down, looking at his property with the particular expression of a man who has just been reminded of what he has and intends, this time, to pay proper attention to it. May Sutton appeared in the back doorway, assessed the expression on his face, and nodded once to herself in the manner of someone whose expectations have been confirmed. Eliza unsaddled her horse and led him to the stall and checked water and feed with the practiced ease of someone who has done this enough times that the actions belong to her hands without requiring her full attention. She stood in the barn for a moment in the quiet. She thought about tomorrow, about the 90-day window, about the files in the suitcase, and what it would mean to take them out of the suitcase and give them to someone with the authority to use them properly, about the independent assessor who would come to the East Ridge and find what Webb had found, and the conversation that would follow, and the shape of what Red Hollow might become when the question of its water, and the question of who had been manipulating that question for decades, was finally asked in rooms with enough light for everyone to see. She thought about the long table at the Grange Hall, and the particular quality of the silence that had followed Colt sitting down, and what that silence had meant and what it had grown into. She didn't feel triumphant. That wasn't the word for what she felt. It was something quieter and more complicated, the particular feeling of someone who has been running for a long time and has stopped, not because they're safe, necessarily, but because this ground is worth standing on. She blew out the barn lantern and walked back toward the house, through the cooling evening air, where the lights were on in the kitchen, and the smell of May Sutton's supper was reaching the yard, and somewhere behind her the East Ridge held its water in the open air for the first time in 30 years, patient and purpose, and exactly where it had always been. The 90 days didn't pass quietly. Nothing in Red Hollow passed quietly anymore, not after the commission hearing, not after Margaret Drum told the story of the session to everyone who came through the dry goods store for the next 2 weeks, not after Frank Drum's South well came back with clean running water 10 days after the storm, and he stood in his yard looking at it, with his hat in his hands, and didn't say anything for a long time because there wasn't anything to say that the water wasn't already saying for him. The valley talked. That was what valleys did, and Red Hollow had been waiting for something to talk about. That wasn't drought or debt or the slow grinding diminishment of small operations trying to survive beside large ones. The commission hearing gave them something with more shape to it, a story with a villain people recognized, and a set of facts they could examine and disagree about, and ultimately form opinions on, which was what communities needed to feel like communities rather than just collections of people living in proximity. Eliza heard most of it secondhand through May Sutton's reliable intelligence network and the Thursday morning dry goods conversations and the occasional direct report from Margaret Drum, who had apparently decided that keeping Eliza informed was now part of her weekly responsibilities. The opinions were not uniformly favorable. There were people in Red Hollow who had done business with Harriet Boone for years and weren't prepared to change their assessment of her on the basis of a commission hearing that had ended in a delay rather than a decision. There were people who thought Thomas Dalton had been foolish not to sell the East 40 acres when he'd had the chance, and that his current situation was the natural consequence of his own stubbornness. There were people who thought Eliza had shown up out of nowhere and inserted herself into a local dispute she didn't fully understand, and that however things turned out, there was something presumptuous about a woman who'd been in town 3 months, telling families who'd been there 3 generations what was on their land. She heard that last one on a Thursday and rode home with it, sitting somewhere in her chest that evening. Not because it was entirely wrong, there was a version of the criticism that was fair, but because the part that stung was the word presumptuous, which was one of the words people had always used for women who knew things and said so. She told Colt about it that evening, at the East Ridge fence where they'd been meeting with increasing regularity, in the way that 2 people establish patterns of proximity without formally deciding to. They're not entirely wrong, she said. He looked at her sideways. About which part? The part about me not being from here. She leaned on the fence rail and looked out at the depression in the ridge, which was larger now. The surface had continued settling in the weeks after the storm, widening the exposure, and a thin, persistent trickle from the opening had been running east along the old creek bed, which was remarkable for a season this dry. I don't know the history of every family in this valley. I don't know what Thomas's wife was like, or what it cost Frank Drum to build that place, or what the Kelsey family went through before Jim was born. I came here 3 months ago, and I read some land surveys, and I pressed my hands on the ground and told people what I found. And you were right, Colt said. Being right isn't the same as belonging, she said. He was quiet for a moment. This was one of the things she'd come to value about him. He didn't rush past a hard thing to get to the comforting response. He sat with it. No, he said finally, it's not. He shifted his weight on the fence rail. But belonging isn't something you're given. Not here, not anywhere I've ever been. It's something that happens through time and through doing and through people deciding, one at a time, whether you're worth trusting. He paused. Margaret Drum drove 40 minutes to Sutter Creek on a muddy road at 7 months' notice to sit in a room and stand up for what you found. Frank Drum shook your hand after the hearing, like a man who'd been handed something back he thought was gone. He looked at her directly. That's not nothing. That's the beginning of belonging. She didn't answer immediately. She looked at the trickle of water finding its way along the old creek bed, the patient eastward movement of something that had been underground for decades, and was now simply out in the open. The files, she said. It wasn't a transition, exactly, more like a continuation of the same thought. Yes, he said. I've been thinking about timing. She'd been thinking about it since the commission hearing, since the ride home through the mud, when they'd talked for 50 minutes, and she'd said this ground is worth standing on in the private language of thinking out loud, not quite saying it, but meaning it completely. If I take those documents to the state land office, it opens a formal investigation into Bess and the fraudulent filings and anyone connected to that methodology, including, possibly, the way the 1,871 amendment was suppressed on this property. That would put Harriet's family history under examination, Colt said. Her grandfather was the county surveyor who filed the amendment in the separate ledger, Eliza said. If the investigation finds a pattern, if what Bess was doing traces back to a method that originated here, then what Harriet has been doing to this valley isn't a new thing. It's an inheritance, a deliberate one. Colt turned this over for a moment. That's a serious allegation. It's a serious situation, she said. I've been running from it for 8 months, and I'm tired of running. He looked at her, the judgment. If I file a formal complaint with the state land office and produce those documents as supporting evidence, Howard Bess will almost certainly respond by trying to enforce the civil judgment, which means a legal proceeding in which I'm named. She'd been over this enough times that the edges of it were worn smooth. I'd need someone who understands county property law to advise me, and I'd probably need to stay in one place long enough for the proceeding to run its course. How long would that take? A year maybe, possibly 2. He held her gaze. Is that a question for me? I'm not asking you to decide anything, she said carefully. I'm telling you what the situation is because you're the person I want to tell. She paused, working at precision, because precision mattered here in a way it didn't always. And because if I'm going to stay in Red Hollow for a year or 2, that fact is probably relevant to you. A long silence, the kind she'd learned to sit inside without filling. I know a county attorney in Sutter Creek, he said. Honest, which is rarer than it should be. He's handled property disputes for 20 years, and he doesn't like Harriet Boone, which is a bonus but not the main reason I'd trust him. He watched the water moving along the creek bed. His name is Samuel Pratt. I can introduce you. She let out a breath that she hadn't fully known she was holding. All right, she said. He turned to look at her with the unguarded expression she'd first seen outside the commission room in Sutter Creek. Just her name said, with a directness that had no performance in it. I'd like you to stay for more reasons than the legal proceeding. You know that. She did know it. She'd known it for weeks in the particular way. You know things that you're not yet ready to say out loud, because saying them out loud changes what they are. I know, she said. Neither of them said anything else about it that evening. They didn't need to. Some things are established, not in the moment they're finally stated, but in the accumulation of smaller moments that made the statement inevitable, the fence line meetings, the kitchen table discussions, the way he always positioned himself slightly between her and the room when they walked into public spaces, not protectively in the diminishing sense, but in the simple physical language of a man who has decided where he stands and is making that decision visible. She went to see Samuel Pratt the following Tuesday. He was older than she'd expected, late 60s, with the particular leanness of a man who had been working hard for a long time and had forgotten to eat enough on a regular basis. He had an office in Sutter Creek above a printer's shop, small and organized in the specific way of someone who knows exactly where everything is, even when no one else could find it. He listened to her account of Howard Bess with his elbows on the desk and his fingers laced together, and he asked questions at precise intervals, not interrupting, just redirecting toward detail he needed. When she finished, he sat for a moment. "The fraudulent filings you copied," he said. "What form are they in?" "Original documents. I transcribed them by hand before I left. I didn't have access to a press copy, so I wrote them out line for line." She'd been over this in her head enough times to present it cleanly. "They're in my handwriting, which makes them unverified copies rather than original documents. But the document numbers are specific. A state land office investigator could pull the originals from the county records in the district where Bess operated. They're still on file? They were when I left. Fraudulent filings of that type would need to be actively removed, which requires knowing they're there, which requires someone looking." She paused. "Bess's strategy has always been that no one looks." Pratt nodded slowly. "The civil judgment against you. Filed after my departure. I was not present for the proceeding. Grounds, unauthorized removal of confidential client documents." She met his eyes. "The documents I removed were my own work notes. The copies of the fraudulent filings aren't mentioned in the judgment because Bess didn't know I had them." He suspected it, but couldn't prove it. Pratt was quiet for a moment. "If you file with the state land office and Bess learns about it, he will amend his claim to include the copies." "Yes, and the proceeding will become partly about you and partly about him." "Yes." He looked at her steadily. "Why are you doing this?" She'd been asked versions of this question by Thomas, by May, by her own reflection in the wash basin mirror, on mornings when the calculation of what it would cost seemed larger than usual. She'd worked on an answer that was honest without being more than she wanted to give. "Because I've been carrying it for 8 months, she said. "And because the method Bess used is the same method that's been used against people in this valley. And because the people in this valley are real, and the damage to them is real, and I have something that might help stop it." She paused. "And because I am tired of being the person who knows something and says nothing." Pratt looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached for a piece of paper and a pen. "Tell me the document numbers," he said. She did. The State Land Office investigation was formally opened 6 weeks after Eliza's meeting with Samuel Pratt. It was opened quietly. Pratt had advised patience and strategic silence, and she'd followed his advice, and the quiet of it meant that when the investigator's letter arrived at Howard Bess's office, requesting access to the disputed filing records, Bess had no forewarning and no prepared response. She learned about Bess's reaction through Pratt, who learned about it through channels he didn't fully explain and she didn't ask about. Bess had initially denied everything, which was predictable. Then the state investigator had pulled the original filings from the county records, which were exactly where Eliza's transcribed copies said they would be, which was less predictable for Bess, who had apparently operated for years under the assumption that the records' existence and their legibility were two different things. The investigation expanded to include 3 counties. It would take, Pratt estimated, the better part of 18 months to fully resolve. The civil judgment against Eliza was formally contested by Pratt's office on the grounds of procedural irregularity in the original proceeding, specifically that it had been filed during a window when the defendant was demonstrably outside the county and had not been properly served. That contest was ongoing, and its outcome was uncertain, which was the honest version of what Pratt told her, and she appreciated the honesty. In the meantime, Red Hollow continued to talk. The independent commission assessor arrived in November, a woman named Dr. Frances Okafor from the State Geological Survey, who spent 2 weeks on the Dalton property and portions of the Drum and Kelsey properties with equipment more sophisticated than anything Webb had brought, and a methodical thoroughness that Webb, upon meeting her, apparently approved of with a single restrained nod. Her preliminary findings confirmed the subsurface formation. Her full report, delivered to the commission in December, established a regional water feature of significant extent, running beneath approximately 1,100 acres of valley floor, touching portions of 6 properties including the Dalton Ranch. Harriet Boone's diversion rights petition was formally denied in January. Eliza heard about it on a Tuesday morning from May Sutton, who had heard about it from Margaret Drum, who had been in the county clerk's office for an unrelated matter and had seen the notification posted in the public record. May delivered the information over coffee in the kitchen, with the contained satisfaction of someone who has been waiting for a specific outcome and refuses to make a spectacle of being right. Thomas sat at the table and absorbed it. He looked older than he had in September, but not worse the particular aging that comes from a hard year lived through rather than survived, which leaves different marks. "Done," he said. "The petition is," Eliza said. "Harriet is not." He looked at her. You think she'll try something else. She's been waiting for this land since her grandfather surveyed it. That doesn't stop because a commission denied one petition. She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. But she's working from a weaker position now. The investigation into the filing methodology, the regional water assessment, the public attention from the hearing, she has fewer tools and more scrutiny. She paused. She's not finished, she's just slower. Thomas nodded. He'd learned over the past 4 months to receive Eliza's assessments without the surprised resistance that had characterized his early responses. Not because he'd become passive more, because he'd developed, slowly, the particular trust that comes from watching someone be right enough times that you start to assume the pattern will hold. What about the East Ridge development? He said. Okafor's report mentioned potential access point infrastructure. Pratt is reviewing whether a formal water rights registration makes sense. The feature is registered as a documented source. It gives the property a legal protection that's harder to route around than a diversion claim. She'd been going over this with Pratt for weeks. It also opens the possibility of a shared access arrangement with the neighboring properties Drum, Kelsey, the others in the formation zone, which would give them formal rights in the water source and a financial stake in protecting it. Thomas was quiet for a moment. That changes what this ranch is. Changes what it can be, she said. What it actually becomes is up to you. He looked at her across the table, the same table where she'd spread the survey amendment papers 4 months ago, where Webb had written his preliminary assessment at midnight, where Thomas had drafted his commission letters in her handwriting, translated into his signature. The table had accumulated meaning in the way that tables in working kitchens do, absorbing the weight of the decisions made around them. I'd like you to be part of figuring that out, he said. If you're staying, she met his eyes. I'm staying, she said. The question of Colt Mercer was not a simple thing, and it didn't resolve itself simply, which was appropriate. Simple resolutions were for situations that had been simple to begin with, and nothing about what had developed between them since September had been simple in any dimension. They had the conversation in February, on a cold afternoon at the East Ridge, which had become their place the way places do by accumulation of meetings, until the location becomes inseparable from the relationship. The depression in the ridge was partially frozen at the edges now, the exposed water surface quiet and still under the winter light. She'd walked the fence line before he arrived, the way she still did every morning, the circuit of the property that had become the rhythm of her days. He said, I want to ask you something, and I want you to know I'm asking, because I mean it and not, because I think the situation requires it. She waited. I'd like you to stay at the Mercer place, he said. Not instead of here, but with me, when it makes sense to you. When you're ready for that. She looked at him steadily. He was looking back with the quality of attention she'd first noticed across a crowded room in September. The look that took things in without categorizing them first. The situation doesn't require it, she agreed. No, she said, doesn't. I'm in the middle of a legal proceeding, she said, which will probably run for another year. Thomas needs someone at this ranch who knows the water documentation. I know, he said, and I'm not the same person I was before I left wherever I came from, she said. I don't know if I'll ever be easy to live with. I'm not soft in the ways people want women to be soft. I noticed that in approximately the first 5 minutes of knowing you, he said. Without irony, without edge, just a fact, she almost smiled. That's not reassuring. I'm not trying to reassure you, he said. I'm trying to be accurate. She looked at the frozen edge of the water in the Ridge Depression and thought about her mother in the rented room, with nothing to show for 30 years of careful invisibility. She thought about Howard Bess's letter, which she'd finally burned in October, feeding it to the stove in her room and watching the paper curl and go dark. She thought about the suitcase, which was still on the windowsill but held different things. Now the transcribed documents were with Pratt. The court judgment was in contest. Photograph and the worn letter were the only artifacts of the before time that she hadn't yet decided what to do with, and she was less certain they needed deciding than she'd once thought. She thought about what belonging meant. Not the performed version, not the version that required you to make yourself smaller or softer or more convenient, the real version. The one that was built through time and doing, and people deciding one at a time that you were worth trusting. Ask me again in the spring, she said. He nodded. One nod clean and without hurt in it. All right, he said. Which was, she'd long since understood the way Colt Mercer said, I'll be here. Spring came late that year, the way it does in high country reluctantly, in stages, with false starts and cold reversals that made you doubt it was coming at all before it finally arrived with the particular conviction of something that was always going to happen. Creek bed on the east side of the Dalton property ran full through March and April, fed by snowmelt and the underground source and the 2 months of intermittent rain that followed the winter. The depression in the ridge had become, by April, something closer to a proper pool, not large, but permanent, clear-watered, fed from below. Thomas had a surveyor come and take formal measurements of the pool and its feed rate. The numbers were better than expected. Aldous Webb, when he saw Okafor's full report, allowed himself an expression that in anyone else would have been pride, and in him was merely elevated professional satisfaction. He sent Thomas a letter, 2 sentences, noting that the feature was more substantial than his preliminary assessment had indicated, and that he stood by his methodology. The shared access arrangement Eliza and Pratt had been developing took shape through March, and was formally proposed to the Drum, Kelsey, and 3 other Valley families in April. It was not a simple document. Pratt was thorough in a way that added pages, and not every family agreed immediately, and there were 3 rounds of revision and 1 meeting at the Grange Hall that ran 4 hours and ended with Frank Drum and Jim Kelsey arguing about fence line easements in a way that had nothing to do with the water agreement and everything to do with a disagreement about a horse that had apparently occurred 15 years ago. But it came together. By May, 5 families had signed a shared water access agreement that registered the East Ridge Formation as a documented regional source, established joint maintenance obligations for the access infrastructure, and created a framework for managing the water allocation through drought years that was fair in the specific, argued over, imperfect way of things built by people with competing interests who have decided that the alternative to compromise is worse than the compromise itself. Harriet Boone did not sign. She had not been invited to sign, and if she had been invited, she would not have done so. But her position in the valley had shifted in ways that were visible to anyone paying attention. Commission hearing had been public. The denial of her petition had been public. The State Land Office investigation, when it became known and in a county this size, it became known had produced a specific kind of social damage that money could cushion but not entirely repair. People still did business with her. She still owned 3,000 acres. But when she walked into a room now, the calculation of her power was different than it had been before September. And she knew it, and the people in the room knew it, and the knowledge lived in the air between them, in the uncomfortable way of things that have been named. Clara Finch stopped coming to the dry goods store on Thursdays, which Eliza noticed and did not comment on. Burke Aldous resigned from the commission board in March, citing personal reasons, which no one in Red Hollow believed were personal. June Pell was appointed interim chair for the remainder of the term. The Howard Bess investigation produced its first formal findings in April. 3 fraudulent filing schemes confirmed across 2 counties, affecting 17 properties, with a 4th scheme under review that potentially implicated a set of earlier records in Harriet Boone's home county. Samuel Pratt called Eliza into his office to tell her in person, which she appreciated. He also told her that Bess's attempt to amend the civil judgment to include her copied documents had been denied on evidentiary grounds. The originals in the county record had been found exactly where her transcriptions said they would be, which established her accuracy and functionally undermined the claim that her copies were anything other than what she'd said they were. The civil judgment itself was still under contest. That would take longer. Pratt was honest about the timeline. Could be another 8 months, he said. Could be more. Bess's attorney is competent, I know, she said. I have time, she said it, without calculation, without the provisional quality that used to live underneath her statements about time and place. She had time because she was staying, and she was staying because the ground was worth standing on. And those were facts now, rather than possibilities she was still deciding about. The Grange Hall held its annual harvest gathering at the end of September, 1 year after the night. Eliza had walked in carrying pots of venison stew, and Harriet Boone had looked at her the way you look at something you've accidentally stepped in. She almost didn't go. Not because she was afraid of it. She'd stopped being afraid of the Grange Hall sometime in January, which was when she'd realized that her mental picture of the room had changed. The room was the same. The people were mostly the same. What had changed was the picture she had of herself in it, and that picture had changed because she'd earned a different relationship to this particular piece of geography through a year of specific work. You can't be made to feel like you don't belong somewhere, that you have literally kept alive. She almost didn't go because she was tired. Honestly, the bone-deep tiredness of a year that had been very full, and the prospect of the social performance of a community gathering felt, on the Tuesday before the event, like more than she had energy for. May Sutton settled the question by appearing in the doorway of Eliza's room at 6 o'clock on the Friday evening of the gathering and informing her that she was going, a statement that brooked no elaboration. Thomas drove them in the wagon. May sat in the back with a covered dish. Eliza sat on the bench beside Thomas and watched the road, which she knew now in all its conditions: summer dust, autumn mud, winter ice, spring softness, the way you know a road you've traveled enough times to have opinions about its character. The Grange Hall was full when they arrived. She stood in the doorway for a moment, the same doorway, the same smell of pine sap and old ambition, and looked at the long table draped in white cloth gone slightly yellow at the edges. Then she walked in. Margaret Drum saw her first and waved with the uninhibited directness of a woman who has decided that social decorum is optional and affection is not. Frank was beside her, and he nodded a specific nod, the kind that communicates more than the gesture, the nod of a man acknowledging a debt that can't be repaid in any simple currency. Ada Kelsey, across the room, caught her eye and smiled with the full, genuine warmth of someone for whom things had gone well enough this year to have warmth to spare. The fourth child had been born in late winter, a girl they'd named June, which Ada had told Eliza was for June Pell, which was the kind of decision that would have seemed strange 6 months ago and made complete sense now. She found a seat at the table, not near the door, not at the edge. Near the middle, where Margaret had saved a space beside her with the proprietary certainty of someone who has decided where things belong and is prepared to enforce that decision. Colt came in 20 minutes after her. He found her without looking around the room, which told her something she already knew. He took the seat on her other side. He didn't make anything of it. He poured himself coffee from the pot on the table and said something to Frank about the fence line on the north pasture in the easy shorthand of men who have worked the same country long enough to discuss it efficiently. She sat between them and looked down the long table at Thomas, who was talking to Jim Kelsey with the relaxed animation of a man who has something worth talking about, at May, who was being May, which was to say competent and watchful and quietly satisfied in the manner of someone who has managed things to an acceptable outcome, at the Valley families who filled the room in all their complicated, flawed, arguing, loyal, frightened, brave, ordinary humanity. The table that a year ago had been a boundary was just a table now. A long table in a room full of people who were working out, imperfectly and continuously, the question of how to love alongside each other in a hard country with limited resources and competing needs. That question didn't have a final answer. It never did. It was the kind of question that required renegotiation every season, every drought year, every time someone new walked through the door with a worn suitcase and a secret they weren't ready to tell. She'd been that person. She was something different now, not entirely different, not transformed in the clean way of stories that prefer their endings tidy. She was still the woman who couldn't sleep easily, who carried things quietly and showed them to almost no one, who had a legal proceeding running in a county office that might go in any direction for another year. She still had the photograph in the suitcase and the worn letter she hadn't decided what to do with. She still woke sometimes in the night with the particular anxiety of someone who spent too many years expecting the ground to shift. But she was also the woman who had pressed her hands to the earth and read what it was saying, who had walked into a commission room with documents she'd spent 8 months being afraid to show anyone and showed them, who had said, "My place is wherever I've earned the right to stand in a room full of people," who'd already decided the answer was nowhere, and then spent a year proving them wrong, not by arguing the point, but by doing the work until the argument became unnecessary. That year had taught her things that couldn't be unlearned. Some of them were practical: how to file a classification request, how to read a subsurface geological formation, how to time the release of information for maximum effect in a procedural setting. Some of them were less practical and more important. She'd learned that belonging is not given. She'd believed that before, abstractly, but now she knew it the way you know things that have been tested. You don't earn belonging through silence or compliance, or making yourself small enough that no one objects to your presence. You earn it through showing up and doing the thing that needs doing, and being willing to absorb the cost of being visible. Some people will hate you for it. Some people will change their minds eventually. Some people will never change their minds and will simply become less important to your life as your life fills with people who have chosen differently. She'd learned that one person deciding to sit beside you can change the geometry of a room, but only if you stay in the room. The gesture is the beginning. The staying is the proof. She'd learned that secrets have weight, and that the weight is cumulative, and that there is a point at which the cost of carrying something is greater than the cost of letting it be seen. She hadn't fully arrived at that understanding. By choice, she'd arrived at it by exhaustion, which was probably the more honest way most people arrived there. The worn suitcase on the windowsill was lighter now than it had been in September. Some of that was the documents Pratt was holding. Some of it was harder to quantify. She'd learned that a man who will sit down at a table no one else will sit at is a rare thing. and that rarity is worth something specific, not gratitude, exactly, which implies a debt, but a kind of matching, a mutual decision to occupy the same ground. Down the table, someone had started telling a story that was apparently funny, because laughter moved through the room in the uncontrolled, natural way of laughter that isn't performed. Thomas was laughing. May allowed herself what was, for May, a broad smile. Frank Drum had his arm around his wife and his face open in a way she'd only seen from him once before, standing at his well after the storm when the water came back clean. "You're thinking," Colt said beside her. "I'm always thinking," she said. "More than usual," he corrected. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking down the table in the relaxed way of a man comfortable in a room, but his attention was on her. She knew the quality of it by now. "I was thinking about this table," she said, "what it was last year and what it is now." He picked up his coffee cup. "It's a table," he said. "It was always just a table." She looked at him. He met her eyes with the slight lift at the corner of his mouth that was in Colt Mercer's emotional vocabulary the equivalent of a wide grin. "You know what I mean," she said. "I know exactly what you mean," he said. "I'm telling you the table didn't change. The people changed." She considered that. He wasn't wrong, technically. The table was the same wood, the same slightly yellowed cloth, the same iron lantern hooks above it. What had changed was the set of decisions made around it, decisions made by specific people who had weighed the cost of a choice and made it anyway, imperfectly and without guarantee, because the alternative was a room where the boundaries stayed where they'd always been, and nobody questioned whether they were right. Harriet Boone was not here tonight. She would not have been comfortable here tonight, which was not a punishment anyone had designed and not something Eliza took satisfaction in exactly. It was simply the natural consequence of a room that had rearranged itself around a different set of values than the ones Harriet had spent her life enforcing. The room had not rejected Harriet. Harriet had rejected the room's evolution, which was a distinction that mattered even if the outcome looked similar from the outside. Clara Finch was here in the far corner, talking to a woman Eliza didn't recognize. She glanced at Eliza once during the evening and looked away without the social calculation that used to animate those glances. The particular malice had diminished, not disappeared, but diminished, in the way of things that lose energy when they're no longer being fed. People were not better than they'd been a year ago. That was the honest version. They were not transformed into something nobler by a commission hearing and a water discovery and a year of difficult conversations. They were still the same people with the same complicated private lives and the same capacity for smallness and generosity in roughly equal measure. What had changed was one structural fact. The story they told about this valley and who belonged in it had been, in some small and specific way, revised. The revision was incomplete and contested, and would need to be defended in the ongoing way of all things worth having. But it was real. That was what mattered. Not perfect, not finished, but real. May appeared at her elbow at some point in the evening and sat down with a plate and said, without preamble, "Thomas has been talking to Jim Kelsey about a joint foaling operation. Using the Kelsey pastures in the east section, she fork-speared a piece of venison. He'll need someone who knows horses, I know," Eliza said. "I thought you might," May said. She ate with the satisfaction of someone whose plans are proceeding on schedule, which Eliza reflected. They generally were, because May Sutton was one of those people who manage situations through the force of her expectations, rather than any overt action. And her expectations had been running ahead of everyone else's for most of the past year. The evening ran late in the comfortable way of gatherings that have found their rhythm. Conversations deepening and shifting across the room, children falling asleep in corners, the older ranchers moving into the slow reminiscing mode of men and women for whom the past is more immediately present than it is for younger people. Eliza talked to Frank Drum for 20 minutes about water table dynamics in drought years and found herself genuinely engaged in the conversation in the particular way of talking to someone who is paying real attention and adding to what you're thinking rather than waiting for their turn to speak. Frank Drum, it turned out, had been thinking about the valley's water for decades he just hadn't had. Until this year, anyone who made it feel worth saying out loud. She thought about that on the ride home. Thomas driving, May in the back with her empty dish, Colt riding alongside on the gray in the cool night air. She thought about all the thinking that happens in silence because there's no one to receive it. All the knowledge that sits in people's hands and eyes and doesn't get used because the conditions that would allow it to useful have never been created. She thought about the East Ridge and what she'd found there not discovered, exactly. Because the formation had been there for 50 years, and Frank Drum had been thinking about the valley's water for decades, and Webb had the skills to document it, and Colt had the surveyors and the county records instinct. What she'd contributed was maybe simply the willingness to look directly at what was there and say what she saw, even in a room where the saying was going to cost her. That was not nothing. She'd spent a long time thinking it was nothing. She was still working on believing otherwise. The Dalton Ranch came into view at the end of the road. The East Ridge was dark against the sky, but she knew its shape now, the way she knew the shapes of the horses in their stalls by heart, which is the name for the kind of knowing that lives below the level of thought. Thomas pulled the wagon into the yard, and they all climbed down and moved through the familiar rhythms of the end of an evening horses unhitched, and led to their stalls, maize dish carried in, the lights coming on in the kitchen in the warm, ordinary way of houses that are inhabited by people who intend to continue inhabiting them. Colt stayed a few minutes in the yard. He'd said his formal goodbyes inside, but he lingered the way he did, the gray horse patient at the hitching post. She walked out to where he stood. "Spring," she said. He looked at her. "You asked me in February to answer you in spring," she said. "I'm a few months late. You've been busy," he said. Without irony, just acknowledgement. "I have." She looked up at the stars, which were bright and cold above the dark hills. "Yes," she said, "when the legal proceeding is resolved. Or before if it takes too long." She paused. "The answer is yes." He didn't respond immediately, which she'd expected. He was a man who received important things quietly and processed them in the space of a beat or two before showing you what he thought about them. When he looked at her, what was in his face was what she'd seen occasionally in unguarded moments over the past year, the full version of what he felt, without the careful management that characterized his public expression. "All right," he said, which meant, as it always had, "I'll be here. I've been here. I'm not going anywhere." She stood in the yard after he rode out, in the dark and the cold and the particular quiet of a ranch at night, with everyone inside and everything accounted for, and looked at the East Ridge against the sky. The pool at the depression point would be still now, clear and cold, the underground source keeping it steady through all the seasons, all the conditions, patient in the way of things that have been waiting a long time to be found and, once found, don't require anything further to justify their existence. Just to be acknowledged. Just to have someone stand at the edge and say, "This is real. This matters. This was always here." She'd come to Red Hollow with nothing but a worn suitcase and a secret she wasn't ready to tell and the exhausted intention of disappearing. That plan had lasted exactly one evening, which was maybe the fastest any plan of hers had ever dissolved, and she'd spent a year building something in the space where it used to be. She wasn't finished building it. She wouldn't be finished for a long time. Maybe ever. That was the honest version of what building something real, in a real place with real people actually looked like. It was ongoing, it was imperfect. It was worth it in the specific, unsentimentalized way of things that have been hard-won and therefore mean exactly as much as they cost. She went inside. The kitchen was warm, and May was putting things away, and Thomas was sitting at the table with a cup of coffee, and the look of a man who has nowhere pressing to be and finds that condition, for the first time in a long time, pleasant. She sat down across from him. Outside, the East Ridge held its water in the dark, and the creek bed ran east the way it always had. And the valley breathed in the particular rhythm of a place that is still working out what it wants to become, which is, finally, the condition of any place worth living in. This is a work of fiction created solely for entertainment purposes. All characters, locations, and events are entirely imaginary.